The laughter was what cut deepest, not the pitying glances from relatives she barely knew, not the whispered comments about her swollen belly or the absent husband, not even Sterling's smirk as the lawyer read through mansion after mansion, portfolio after portfolio, none of it bearing her name. It was the laughter, sharp, careless, echoing off the mahogany walls of her dead grandmother's study, when Judge Caldwell finally read the last line of Lenora Holloway's will. To my granddaughter, Briar Holloway, I bequeath my cabin property in Hollow Creek, including all contents therein. Someone snickered. Then Cordelia's voice, polished and cruel. The hunting shack, that rotting thing in the middle of nowhere. Sterling leaned back in his chair, gold watch catching the light. Well, at least it's shelter. You'll need it in your condition. Briar stood with one hand pressed against her belly, feeling her daughter kick hard, insistent, as if protesting on her mother's behalf. She closed her fingers around the iron key the lawyer had pressed into her palm. Its teeth formed a pattern she didn't recognize. Its weight felt deliberate, like a sentence handed down. She didn't know it yet, couldn't possibly have known, but that rusted key opened more than a cabin door. It opened a war worth $200 million, a legacy soaked in sacrifice, and a truth about her grandmother that would shatter everything she believed about love. Rain patted against the tall windows of the Victorian mansion where Lenora Holloway had lived her public life. The house smelled of furniture, polish, and old money. 47 relatives filled the drawing room, and not one of them had spoken to Briar before the reading began. They spoke about her, of course. They had been speaking about her all morning. 8 months along, and not a sign of the father. Always was Lenora's favorite, though heaven knows why. I heard she was living in a studio apartment. Couldn't even afford the lease renewal. Briar kept her gaze fixed on the Persian rug beneath her feet, counting the threads in the intricate pattern to keep herself from crying. She was 32 years old. 8 months pregnant, recently abandoned by a man who had promised her forever, and now standing in a room full of people who viewed her existence as a cautionary tale. The distribution of assets had proceeded with surgical efficiency. The Victorian mansion, appraised at $4.2 million, went to Sterling. The Hamptons summer house and its accompanying investment portfolio went to Cordelia. Smaller properties, vehicles, jewelry, and art collections were divided among cousins and nieces and nephews who had attended exactly 0 of Lenora's final months. And Briar received a cabin, a forgotten structure on unmarked land deep in the Appalachian wilderness, plus a monthly stipend of $2,000 for, as the will stated, basic maintenance of said property. Cordelia's eyebrow arched with practiced precision. Hardly a fortune, though more than she deserves, given she couldn't even keep a husband. The room did not object to this cruelty. Some smiled. Others looked away, which was worse. After the others filtered out to discuss dinner reservations and flight arrangements, and the general redistribution of a dead woman's life into manageable, profitable pieces, the old lawyer approached Briar privately. His name was Judge Amos Caldwell, retired from the federal bench 15 years ago, and he had served as Lenora's personal counsel for half a century. He was 78 years old, tall and angular, with eyes that had spent decades weighing evidence and finding most of it wanting. Your grandmother was very specific about your inheritance, Miss Holloway. He pressed the heavy iron key deeper into her palm, folding her fingers around it with both of his weathered hands. She insisted you would understand in time. Briar turned the key over, noticing intricate engravings along its shaft, patterns that might have been decorative or might have been something else entirely. It seems cruel, Judge Caldwell. She knew my situation. Lenora Holloway was many things, he replied carefully, but cruel was never one of them. She spoke of that cabin differently than her other properties. He paused, and something shifted behind his eyes, a memory surfacing and then submerging again. She called it her true legacy, Briar wanted to ask what that meant, but exhaustion and grief had hollowed her out. She simply nodded and slipped the key into her coat pocket where it hung like an anchor against her thigh. That evening, alone in her studio apartment for the last time, Briar packed the few belongings worth keeping. The lease expired in 6 days, and the landlord had already shown the unit to 3 prospective tenants. Her savings account held $411. Her credit cards were maxed. The baby was due in 5 weeks, and the only nursery she had prepared existed in her imagination. She folded a handmade quilt that Lenora had given her last Christmas, running her fingers across the intricate stitching. Each square contained a different leaf pattern: oak, maple, birch, elm, all rendered in deep greens and autumn golds. At the time, Briar had thought it merely beautiful. Now she wondered if her grandmother had been trying to tell her something. Some inheritances aren't about money, Briar girl, Lenora had said during their final conversation 2 weeks before the stroke that silenced her forever. Her eyes had been unusually bright, almost feverish. The most valuable things can't be measured in dollars. Briar had assumed this was the philosophy of a woman who had plenty of dollars and could afford to romanticize their absence. Now, holding a key to a cabin she had never visited and facing a future she had never imagined, the words carried a different weight. She placed the key on her nightstand. Moonlight from the window caught the engravings, and for a moment, just a moment, the patterns seemed to form letters. Then the light shifted and they were abstract again. She blamed exhaustion, she blamed grief, she blamed the particular cruelty of inheriting nothing useful from a woman who had owned everything. Tomorrow she would drive to Hollow Creek and face whatever her grandmother had left behind. It was either that or sleep in her car. Dawn broke pale and cold over the city as Briar loaded the last cardboard box into her aging Honda Civic. The car complained under the weight, its suspension groaning with each addition. Her lower back echoed the complaint. 8 months of pregnancy had turned every simple movement into a negotiation between determination and physical limitation. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, stood on the sidewalk in a faded bathrobe, watching with the particular concern of someone who has lived long enough to recognize disaster in its early stages. "That's everything," Briar said, trying to sound definitive rather than defeated. "Everything worth taking," she added, surveying the meager collection that represented 32 years of choices, most of them someone else's. Mrs. Grayson pressed a paper bag into her hands. "Banana bread for the road, and my number if you need anything at all." Briar's throat tightened. Kindness had become such unfamiliar territory that even small gestures threatened to undo her entirely. She hugged the old woman carefully, her belly pressing between them like a promise neither could guarantee. In the glove compartment, she found an envelope she had overlooked during yesterday's packing. Her name was written across the front in Lenora's distinctive script, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and Christmas checks, and the occasional letter that arrived without occasion, containing only observations about the weather and questions about Briar's garden designs. Inside was a hand-drawn map. Not printed directions from an internet search, not GPS coordinates, but a hand-drawn map rendered in ink on heavy cream paper. The kind of map that belonged in a museum or a fairy tale. Winding roads led deep into forested hills. Curious symbols dotted the margins, stars marking certain turns, a crescent moon indicating the final approach. Along one edge ran a series of numbers that made no immediate sense. Briar studied the map for a long time, her trained architect's eye tracing the topographical lines and noting the careful scale. Whoever had drawn this, Lenora or someone before her, understood cartography. The proportions were precise. The landmarks were rendered with the confidence of someone who had walked every foot of the terrain. She started the engine and pulled away from the curb without looking back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. The drive took 6 hours. The highway gave way to state routes, then to county roads increasingly bordered by forest rather than commerce. Strip malls surrendered to farmland. Farmland surrendered to wilderness. The radio signal faded to static somewhere past the last recognizable town, and Briar switched it off, preferring the honest silence. Her mind wandered where she did not want it to go. 6 months ago, Weston's face had drained of color when she shared the news of her pregnancy. They had been married for 3 years together for 5, and she had believed they were building something permanent. She had designed gardens for their future literal gardens, sketched in her notebook during quiet evenings perennial borders and kitchen herb plots for a house they had not yet purchased but spoke of with certainty. "I never signed up for this," he had said, standing in their kitchen with his hands flat on the counter as if bracing against an earthquake, as if their years together had been some contract she had violated by allowing biology to proceed. By evening his closet stood empty. His wedding band sat on the bathroom counter like a period at the end of a sentence. His lawyer's letter arrived 3 days later, efficient and bloodless, requesting dissolution of their marriage with no contested assets, because as it turned out there was nothing to contest. Everything of value had been his: the apartment lease, the savings account, the retirement fund. Even the car she now drove had been a gift from her grandmother, purchased in cash. The one asset Weston's attorney could not claim, because Lenora had been wise enough to put it in Briar's name alone. Briar had replayed that kitchen scene 1,000 times in the months since editing it in her memory, the way she used to edit landscape designs, trying different angles, adjusting the lighting, looking for the moment where she could have said something that changed the outcome. But the truth, the inescapable architectural truth of their marriage, was that Weston had designed his exit before she ever announced her entrance. He had kept his name on every account, his signature on every lease, his ownership of every object that mattered. Their marriage had been his building, and she had been a tenant who mistook occupancy for ownership. The baby kicked against Briar's ribs, pulling her back to the present. She placed one hand on her belly and the other on the steering wheel and kept driving. The road ahead was unknown. The road behind was uninhabitable. The only direction left was forward into the mountains toward a cabin she had never seen, carrying a key she did not understand, and a child she had not planned but already loved with a ferocity that frightened her. At a small gas station, the last outpost before the road surrendered entirely to the mountains, Briar refueled and studied Lenora's map. The station was the kind of place that existed outside of time: hand-painted prices on a wooden sign, a single pump, a screen door that slapped shut with the authority of a judge's gavel. The attendant emerged slowly, a weathered man in his 70s with hands that had clearly spent decades in honest work. His name tag read Silas. "Hollow Creek," he said, not as a question. He had seen the map in her hands. "Ain't many folks headed that way these days. My grandmother left me property there." Recognition moved through his face like weather across a mountain. "You'd be Lenora Holloway's girl then." He removed his cap, held it against his chest for a moment. "Heard she passed. I'm sorry. She was a fine woman." Briar nodded, surprised by the genuine grief in his voice. "She stopped here regular," Silas continued, replacing his cap. "Always with cash and kind words, never in a hurry, even when you could tell the world was chasing her." He pointed to a narrow road branching off behind the station. "That turnoff's easy to miss. Watch for the lightning-struck oak about 2 miles in. Big thing split right down the middle, but still alive. Turn left there." Briar thanked him and returned to her car, pondering this glimpse into her grandmother's hidden life. The Lenora she knew wore tailored suits and commanded boardrooms with the quiet authority of someone who understood that real power never needed to raise its voice. Yet apparently she also frequented rural gas stations where 70-year-old attendants knew her by name and mourned her with the sincerity of old friends. 2 lives. Her grandmother had lived 2 lives, and Breyer was only now discovering that the public one, the mansions and portfolios and society pages, might have been the performance. The paved road eventually surrendered to gravel. Breyer's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the Honda bounced over rocks and ruts that seemed designed to discourage visitors. According to the map, she had passed the 3rd star marker, meaning only a few miles remained. "What were you thinking, Grandma?" she murmured, wincing as a deep pothole sent a jolt through her spine and into the baby. "This is no place to bring a child." But even as she said it, something in the landscape was changing. The forest, which had seemed merely wild from the highway, revealed increasing beauty as she penetrated deeper. The trees grew taller, their canopies forming cathedral arches overhead. Sunlight filtered through autumn leaves in patterns so precise they seemed choreographed. The air pouring through her cracked window carried scents she could not name, but recognized somehow. The way a forgotten song is recognized by the body before the mind can place it. At the crescent moon symbol on the map, she turned onto a track so narrow it was nearly invisible. Branches scraped against the car windows like fingers trying to get her attention. The Honda crept forward at walking pace, its engine whining in protest. Just as she began to fear she had made a terrible mistake, the trees opened. The clearing appeared suddenly, as if the forest had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Late afternoon light poured into the open space, illuminating everything with the golden warmth of an old painting. And there it stood, her inheritance. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined, its timber exterior weathered to a soft silver gray that seemed to glow in the slanting light. A covered porch wrapped around 2 sides with a single rocking chair positioned to face the setting sun. A stone chimney rose from the shingled roof, which sagged very slightly on one side, giving the structure the appearance of something that had settled comfortably into its age rather than surrendered to it. Breyer parked and extracted herself from the driver's seat with the laborious care required by her condition. When she stood, the silence struck her first. Not the absence of sound, but a different quality of sound entirely. Wind through branches, each tree producing a slightly different note. Birdsong layered and complex, like an orchestra warming up. The gentle voice of water somewhere nearby a stream or spring murmuring to itself. She stretched her aching back and pressed both hands against her lower spine, looking up through the canopy. The sky above the clearing was enormous, unconstrained by buildings or power lines. A dome of deepening blue that made the city sky she had lived under for 32 years seem like a ceiling rather than a heaven. The air was different here. Not just cleaner, but more substantial, as if each breath contained information that her lungs had been waiting for, mineral-rich and faintly sweet, carrying the accumulated scent of a forest that had been exhaling for centuries. She approached slowly. Despite the cabin's apparent age, it showed signs of careful maintenance. No broken windows. The porch swept clean. Firewood neatly stacked under a protective overhang in cords so precise they could have been measured with a ruler. What appeared to be herb gardens bordered the path to the front door, even in October, still showing green among the browns and golds of autumn. Breyer recognized rosemary, thyme, lavender, and several plants she could not immediately name, but whose leaves carried the particular dark vigor of species that had been cultivated in the same soil for generations, their root systems so established that seasonal changes barely touched them. A bronze bell hung from a hook at the porch corner, tarnished with age but solid, its clapper wrapped in cloth as if waiting to be silenced or summoned. Beside it, scratched into the wooden beam in letters so small they were nearly invisible, was a single word: Nell. Breyer filed it away without understanding the way she had filed away so many details of this day, trusting that meaning would arrive when it was ready. The porch boards creaked under her weight but did not give. The rocking chair positioned to face the western tree line where the sun was now settling into a bank of amber cloud showed the particular wear pattern of a seat that had been occupied for thousands of hours. Its arms were smooth polished by decades of hands gripping and releasing in the unconscious rhythm of someone watching the forest and thinking thoughts that required no audience. The iron key felt suddenly heavy in her coat pocket. Standing before the weathered door, Briar experienced something she could not explain and did not try to. A sensation of arrival that went beyond geography, as if the journey she had been making was not 6 hours from the city, but 32 years from her birth, every detour and disaster funneling toward this single convergence of woman and threshold. The baby stirred vigorously, more active than she had been all day, pressing and turning as if trying to see through her mother's body to what lay ahead. "Is this home?" Briar whispered, her hand on her belly. "Is this what she meant us to find?" She noticed the carved stone set into the doorframe. Latin words curved around a symbol she recognized from her grandmother's wax seal. A tree with roots as expansive as its branches. Verum in tenebris lucet. Truth shines in darkness. Briar translated it automatically, a remnant of the classical languages course Lenora had insisted she take in college. One of many seemingly arbitrary requirements that her grandmother had attached to the education fund. Take Latin, study botany, learn to read topographical maps. At the time, Briar had assumed these were the eccentricities of an old woman with too much money and too many opinions. Now, standing before a door inscribed with Latin in the Appalachian wilderness, the requirements felt less like eccentricity and more like preparation. The key did not fit at first. Briar jiggled it gently, feeling the mechanism resist. Twilight was deepening around her. She had nowhere else to go, no hotel within 50 miles, $411 to her name. A baby pressing against her bladder with increasing urgency. "Please," she whispered. Something shifted within the lock. The key slid deeper with a sound like tiny chimes, metallic and almost musical, and turned with surprising ease. The door swung inward. Briar had expected darkness, dust, the smell of abandonment and decay. Instead, warm amber light spilled across the threshold. She stood frozen for 3 full breaths, her architect's mind trying to process what her eyes were reporting. The interior of the cabin was significantly larger than the exterior suggested. Not impossibly so, not the physics-defying expansion of a fairy tale, but substantially and measurably larger. Her professional eye began cataloging explanations immediately. Double walls creating the illusion of a smaller exterior. Ceiling height carefully calculated to maximize the perception of space. Windows positioned to draw the eye outward, extending the visual field beyond the physical boundaries. Someone had designed this cabin with extraordinary skill. Not merely built it, but designed it with the kind of sophisticated understanding of space and light and human perception that Briar had spent 4 years studying in architecture school and 7 years trying to master in practice. The source of the amber light was a small fireplace where flames danced steadily, casting warmth across polished wooden floors. "Impossible," Briar murmured. "Who lit the fire?" She checked the porch behind her. Only her own footprints disturbed the thin layer of dust on the boards. No tire tracks in the clearing besides her own. No sign of recent human presence. Judge Caldwell. He must have arranged for someone to prepare the cabin before her arrival. It was the only explanation that made sense, and Briar clung to it even as the details resisted. The fire burned with the steady confidence of a blaze that had been maintained for hours, not the tentative flicker of something recently lit. The air inside smelled of cedar and rosemary and lavender, warm and welcoming, as if the cabin had been inhabited continuously rather than opened for the first time in months. To her right, a compact kitchen featured an antique cast-iron stove, copper pots hanging above, and a basin with an old-fashioned hand pump. A modest dining table held an oil lamp already lit, and beneath it, Briar drew a sharp breath, a sealed envelope bearing her name in Lenora's handwriting. To her left stretched a living space with a deep, comfortable-looking sofa, bookshelves laden with leather-bound volumes, and a rocking chair positioned to catch both the firelight and the view from a large window. The furniture was simple, but showed the kind of craftsmanship that Briar, who had spent years specifying materials and finishes for her landscape designs, recognized immediately as exceptional. Every joint precise, every surface finished with care that bordered on devotion. She moved deeper inside her professional eye, continuing its assessment. The ceiling featured exposed beams arranged in patterns that were not merely structural but aesthetic, drawing the eye upward and outward simultaneously. Built-in shelving seemed to flow organically from the walls, as if the wood had grown into these shapes, rather than been cut into them. The pantry stopped her cold, recently stocked. Flour, sugar, coffee, canned goods, even fresh apples and root vegetables in a wooden bin. A cold box, essentially a small cellar accessed through a floor panel, contained dairy products and eggs. She checked the dates. None were more than 2 days old. The bathroom was rustic, a clawfoot tub, no visible modern plumbing, but immaculately clean. Soft towels hung beside handmade soap. The single bedroom contained a bed with a handmade quilt almost identical to the one Lenora had given her last Christmas, the same leaf patterns, the same deep greens and golds. And beside the bed stood a wooden cradle. Briar's hand flew to her mouth. The cradle was crafted from cherry wood, warm and lustrous, sanded to a smoothness that invited touch. Along its sides, someone had carved an intricate pattern of oak leaves and protective symbols. Celtic knots intertwined with the same tree emblem from the door frame, and her grandmother's seal. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each leaf individually detailed, each knot mathematically precise. "You knew," she whispered to her grandmother's memory, her eyes burning. "Somehow you knew I would come here. You knew about the baby." She ran her fingers along the cradle's smooth edge, and the baby kicked in response, a strong, purposeful movement that seemed to acknowledge the gift prepared for her arrival. Briar returned to the main room, drawn to the envelope on the dining table. She lowered herself carefully into the chair, her feet aching, her back protesting, her heart hammering with a combination of exhaustion and anticipation that made her slightly dizzy. Outside night had claimed the forest completely. Inside, surrounded by firelight and lamplight and the scent of cedar, Briar felt something she had not felt in months, perhaps years. Safety. The word arrived unbidden, and she almost rejected it out of habit. Safety was a luxury she had learned not to trust. Weston had been safe until he wasn't. Her career had been safe until the firm downsized. Her apartment had been safe until the lease expired. But this feeling was different. Older somehow, more fundamental, as if the cabin itself were communicating through warmth and light and silence, telling her something that words would only diminish. She reached for the envelope and broke the wax seal, the same tree emblem, the same dark green wax. Inside, she found several pages of Lenora's handwriting, flowing cursive with sharp angles that she had always thought reflected her grandmother's character. Perfectly graceful, yet precise. Beautiful, yet capable of cutting. "My dearest Briar," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then you have found your way home. Yes, home, though you have never set foot here before today. This cabin has been waiting for you just as I knew you would need it one day. First, let me address what must seem a cruel joke, leaving you this remote cabin while the others received mansions and millions. The family believes I built my fortune through savvy real estate investments and corporate dealings. This is only partially true. The truth, my darling girl, is that this cabin is the source of everything I built, not merely as a place of refuge, though it has been that. This land holds resources and knowledge that cannot be measured in dollars. What appears humble is in fact my most valuable possession, and now yours. I have lived 2 lives. In one I was Lenora Holloway, formidable businesswoman and family matriarch. In the other, my true life, I was simply Lenora, steward of these woods and keeper of knowledge passed down through generations of our family's women. You were chosen for this inheritance long before your current difficulties. When you were born, I held you in my arms and knew your sensitivity, your architect's eye for hidden structures, your intuitive understanding of how living things grow. These are not random talents, but birthright abilities that will flourish here. The child you carry is the next in our line. I have seen her in my dreams. She will have your resilient heart and my stubborn chin. The cradle awaiting her was crafted from wood harvested on this land by my own hands 30 years before you were born. I made it because I knew, not how, not when, but I knew she was coming. Now practical matters. The deed to this property is in the hidden compartment of my writing desk's second drawer left side. Press the panel where the wood grain forms an I shape. You own not just the cabin, but 200 acres surrounding it, with legal protections I have established to prevent development for centuries to come. Follow the light, Briar. This is not metaphorical advice. It is literal instruction. Light behaves differently here. It will guide you when needed. Your first discovery awaits where darkness gathers but never remains. The old lamp beside my bed will show you the way. And remember this above all. You are stronger than you believe. The very difficulties that have brought you here, abandoned, expecting, uncertain, have prepared you to receive what I am giving you. You are exactly who you need to be. I remain with you always, in the pattern of sunlight through branches, in the warmth that greets you at the threshold, in the whisper of water over stone. All my love eternally, Grandma Lenora. P.S. The Latin inscription is our family motto. Remember it when shadows gather, truth shines in darkness. Briar lowered the luster. Tears fell onto the heavy paper, blurring the ink at the edges. The fire crackled gently, and in the silence that followed, she heard the cabin breathing around her, the small sounds of wood settling, wind pressing against walls, the distant voice of the stream she had heard upon arrival. She placed her hand on her belly. Did you hear that, little one? She says you'll have her stubborn chin. The baby kicked once firmly as if confirming. The writing desk stood against the wall between 2 bookshelves. Briar moved to it, examining the second drawer on the left side. The wood grains swirled in organic patterns, and there unmistakably one swirl formed the shape of an eye. She pressed it. A panel clicked and slid aside, revealing a recessed compartment lined with green felt. Inside lay a leather portfolio thick with documents. The first item was the property deed. Official stamped, recorded with the county clerk, listing Briar Holloway as sole owner. 200 acres. The legal description covered 3 pages of coordinates and boundary markers. The second item stopped her breathing. A geological survey conducted by an independent firm 18 months ago. Professional, thorough, 47 pages of analysis and maps and data. Briar's architecture training included enough geology to understand what she was reading, and what she was reading was extraordinary. Beneath the property lay an aquifer. Not a small pocket of groundwater, but a massive interconnected system of underground water reserves fed by 3 natural springs. The survey described water of exceptional purity mineral content that exceeded therapeutic standards flow rates sufficient to supply a small city. In an era when Western states were rationing water, when aquifer depletion was making national headlines, when water rights were being traded like oil futures, Breyer was holding documentation of a resource worth tens of millions of dollars. She sat back in the desk chair, the documents heavy in her hands. This was why Lenora had kept the cabin secret. This was why the monthly stipend was modest while the real wealth lay hidden. This was why Sterling and Cordelia had received mansions and portfolios that, impressive as they were, represented a fraction of the total Holloway estate. Her grandmother had not given her the short end of the stick. She had given her the entire forest and the water beneath it. But with this understanding came a darker realization. If Sterling and Cordelia discovered the aquifer's existence, they would stop at nothing to claim it. And if a development company learned of it, the legal and political machinery that could be brought to bear against a single pregnant woman in a remote cabin would be overwhelming. Breyer returned the documents to the hidden compartment and closed the panel. The eye-shaped wood grain sealed itself seamlessly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The lamp on the bedside table caught her attention next. Lenora's letter had mentioned it specifically. Where darkness gathers but never remains, the old lamp beside my bed will show you the way. It was an antique oil lamp, clearly original, not a reproduction. Brass base, darkened with age-glass chimney, slightly uneven as if hand-blown. The fuel reservoir felt full when Breyer lifted it. She struck a match and touched it to the wick. The flame that rose was not the yellowish flicker she expected. It burned blue-white, intense and steady, casting light with an almost clinical precision. Breyer adjusted the wick, but the color did not change. She examined the fuel reservoir, noting an unusual scent herbal complex, nothing like standard lamp oil. Someone had formulated this fuel deliberately. The blue-white light was chemistry, not magic, though the effect was magical enough. Shadows sprang across the bedroom walls, not chaotic wavering shapes but distinct patterns. Breyer watched as they formed what appeared to be a map of the cabin itself, with one shadow line pointing clearly to the wall beside the bed. She approached the wall, running her fingers along the wooden panels. In normal light, nothing distinguished this section from any other. But in the lamp's blue-white glow, a previously invisible seam appeared between two boards. She pressed gently. The panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a small compartment. Inside lay two items: a wooden box intricately carved with the tree emblem, and a leather-bound journal far older than the documents she had found in the desk. The box opened on silent hinges. Inside, resting on dark velvet, lay a pendant, a silver tree matching Lenora's emblem with roots and branches of equal reach suspended on a chain of unusual metallic links that caught the blue-white light with subtle iridescence. The craftsmanship was stunning. Each root and branch individually rendered the trunk bearing the same Latin motto in letters so small they were nearly invisible. Breyer lifted the pendant and felt its weight settle against her palm. Substantial, warm though it had been enclosed in a cold compartment. She slipped it over her head, and the silver tree came to rest just above her heart. The contact produced an immediate sensation, not supernatural but physical, the way holding a smooth river stone or pressing your palms against warm earth produces a grounding that is felt rather than understood. The journal's pages were yellowed but preserved with meticulous care. Opening to the first entry, Breyer found a date that sent a current through her. March 17th, 1932. The handwriting was not Lenora's. It was older, more formal, the penmanship of a generation that had learned to write with steel nibs and India ink. I have taken refuge in the cabin after George's passing. The depression has taken everything, our savings, our home, and now my husband. Lenora grows within me, moving strongly despite the hardship we have endured. The family believes I have gone to stay with cousins in Richmond. Only my sister knows the truth, that I have come to claim my inheritance as mother instructed before her death. The cabin welcomed me as she said it would. Someone had prepared it, though I cannot determine who. The pantry held food. The fire was laid clean, linens on the bed. Most remarkably, the pains that have troubled my pregnancy these past weeks have ceased entirely since arriving. Whether this is the mountain air or the mineral water from the spring or simply the absence of city stress, I cannot say. But I am grateful beyond expression. Briar looked up from the yellowed pages. The writer was Ada Holloway, her great-grandmother. Lenora had been born here in this very cabin to a woman whose circumstances mirrored Briar's own, with an accuracy that felt less like coincidence and more like pattern. Abandoned, pregnant, stripped of resources, driven to this place not by choice but by the absence of alternatives, and finding here not the punishment she expected but something she could not yet name. Briar read further into the night, discovering Ada's gradual exploration of the property, her growing understanding of its value, and a series of revelations that unfolded across weeks of journal entries. An entry from March 29th described Ada's first visit to the North Spring. I followed the path Mother described, though path is generous. It is more a suggestion made by generations of footfalls through undergrowth. The forest here is unlike any woodland I have known. The trees are enormous, old beyond my capacity to estimate, their trunks wider than my arm span, and their canopies so high they seem to hold up the sky rather than merely grow toward it. I felt watched, though not in the unsettling manner of a city alley at night. Watched the way a mother watches a child exploring a new room with attention and permission simultaneously. The spring was precisely where Mother said it would be. Water rising from the ground with the quiet confidence of something that has been doing exactly this for longer than human memory extends. I drank from it, cupping my hands the way she taught me, and the water was unlike anything I have tasted. Cold and clean and carrying a mineral sweetness that seemed to settle not just in my throat but in my bones. Lenora kicked strongly afterward, the most vigorous movement I have felt from her, as if the water had reached her too. An entry from April 3rd documented Ada's discovery of the three-spring system. There are 3 springs, not one. The South Spring emerges from a rocky outcropping behind the cabin and feeds the stream that runs through the lower meadow. The East Spring is smaller, almost hidden, surfacing in a depression beneath a stand of ancient hemlocks. But the North Spring is the source, the primary upwelling that feeds the others through underground channels I can trace by following the subtle depressions in the ground where the earth sits slightly lower, nourished from beneath. Together they form a system, not random geology, but an interconnected network, each spring drawing from a reservoir deeper and more vast than any of them individually suggests. I begin to understand why this land was chosen by whoever first settled it. The water is not merely present, it is abundant, pure, and if I am reading the seasonal records in the grimoire correctly, effectively inexhaustible. And then came the revelation that appeared in an entry dated April 12th, 1932. I have learned the truth that Mother tried to prepare me for, and I understand now why she could not simply speak it plainly. Some knowledge must be discovered to be believed. Each woman who has served as keeper of this land has sacrificed something to remain, not because the land demands it, but because the world outside does. My mother gave up her family's approval when she chose to live here rather than marry the banker they had selected. Her mother before her gave up a teaching position at the women's college because the distance made it impossible Branded eccentric and reclusive by neighbors who could not understand why a woman of means would choose solitude and forest over society and comfort. And now I face my own choice. Samuel Crawford has asked me to marry him. He is a good man, kind and steady, and he would provide security for Lenora and me in these desperate times. But he has spoken of selling this land to fund a business venture in town. He sees only timber value in a remote location. He cannot see what I have come to see. I have chosen the land. God forgive me if I am wrong. A final entry dated May 1st, 1932 carried a tone of peace that the earlier entries had not possessed. Lenora was born this morning at dawn. Nell's mother, Margaret Harlan, attended the birth with the same competence and compassion that I am told her own mother brought to the births before mine. 3 generations of Harlan women delivering 3 generations of Holloway keepers. Some patterns are too precise for coincidence and too enduring for accident. My daughter has dark eyes and a furrow between her brows that suggests she arrived with opinions already formed. She nursed immediately and with vigor. I held her on the porch in the first light and showed her the clearing, the trees, the distant ridge where the morning star was fading into blue. This is yours, I told her. All of it. The water and the stone and the silence and the responsibility. I will teach you everything I know, and what I do not know, the land will teach you itself. Samuel Crawford came by this afternoon. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin and looked at me holding my daughter, and knew without being told that his proposal had been answered. He tipped his hat and walked back down the mountain, and I watched him go with sadness but not regret. He will find a good woman who wants the life he offers. I want this one. Briar closed the journal and sat in silence. The blue-white lamp had dimmed to a gentle glow, the special fuel burning low. Outside the forest made its nighttime sounds layered and complex. Nothing like the flat silence of her city apartment. The pendant lay warm against her chest. The baby had settled into sleep, her movements reduced to occasional flutters that Briar could feel but barely. She understood now what her grandmother had been telling her. This inheritance was not a gift. It was a choice. Every woman in her line had faced the same decision: keep the land and accept its demands, or sell it and live an easier life. The difficulty was the point. The sacrifice was the price. Not some mystical toll exacted by enchanted ground, but the simple, brutal arithmetic of commitment. You could not protect something this valuable without giving up something else. The question was whether Briar was willing to pay. But there was another thread running through Ada's journal that Briar could not ignore. The Harlan women. Margaret Harlan delivering Ada's baby in 1932. Nell Harlan's name scratched into the porch beam. The bell and its promise. The midwife tradition paralleled the keeper tradition, a companion lineage running alongside the Holloways like a second melody in a song supporting and sustaining the primary line through its most vulnerable moments. Briar was not as alone as she had thought. She had never been as alone as she thought. She placed the journal carefully on the nightstand and left the lamp burning its blue-white light, now soft as a nightlight. She settled beneath the quilt on the bed, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been carrying for months. The mattress received her with exactly the right firmness, supporting her pregnant body in places that had ached for weeks. Sleep came with unexpected ease. The cabin's sounds formed a lullaby she had never heard, but somehow remembered: wood-settling, wind-breathing water speaking to stone in the distance. Her dreams were vivid and strangely comforting. Women in clothing from different eras gathered around a table, their faces both familiar and unknown, each one writing in a book before passing it to the next. For the first time in months, Briar slept deeply and without fear, held by walls that had sheltered women like her for nearly 300 years. Morning arrived through the east-facing bedroom window, painting the quilt in gold. Briar woke and lay still for several minutes, assessing her body with the careful attention pregnancy demands. The persistent ache in her lower back had diminished significantly. The swelling in her ankles, which had kept her awake for weeks in the city, seemed reduced. She felt improbably rested. She touched the silver pendant at her throat. Its metal had retained warmth throughout the night. In the kitchen, fresh bread cooled on the counter, its scent filling the small space with warmth and wheat. Beside it sat a crock of butter and a jar of blackberry preserves. Briar stood before these offerings for a long time, her rational mind wrestling with their presence. No one had entered through the front door. It remained locked from the inside. The windows were latched. But during her exploration the previous evening, she had noticed something in the hidden basement she had not yet fully investigated, a heavy wooden door set into the far wall, partially concealed behind a storage trunk. She had been too exhausted and too pregnant to move the trunk and examine it further. Now she understood. There was a second entrance to the cabin's lower level, likely emerging somewhere in the forest behind the structure. Judge Caldwell, or whoever served as caretaker, could enter the basement, leave provisions in the cold box and kitchen, and depart without ever disturbing the main floor. The explanation was logical. It was also comforting. Briar chose it and moved on. "Thank you," she said softly to the empty room, deciding that acceptance, even without complete understanding, was the appropriate response when someone feeds you and you are hungry. After breakfast, Briar carried Ada's journal to the rocking chair by the window. Outside, morning mist clung to the treetops. Birdsong arrived in waves, different species taking turns as if observing a protocol. The clearing around the cabin shimmered with dew. She read through Ada's entries chronologically, learning how her great-grandmother had explored the property, discovered the 3 springs, and begun to understand the underground water system that connected them. Ada wrote about it with growing wonder and increasing scientific precision, documenting flow rates and mineral content and seasonal variations with the methodical care of a woman who understood that knowledge properly recorded outlasts the person who gathered it. One passage made Briar's architect brain light up. "The sentinel stone beside the North Spring bears markings that I initially took for decoration, but when I placed my hand against the surface at the proper hour, when sunlight enters the clearing at its most acute angle, the marks revealed themselves as a map, not of the surface, but of what lies beneath. The water, the stone, the channels that connect them. Someone long before our family arrived understood this land's hidden architecture and recorded it with a precision I can only admire." The sentinel stone. Briar knew she had to find it. She donned a light jacket and rubber boots she found in the mud room, noting without surprise that they were exactly her size. A walking stick leaned against the wall beside the door, its handle worn smooth by years of gripping, its length precisely right for someone of Briar's height. She took it, grateful for the stability it offered on terrain she did not yet know. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying scents of pine and damp earth and the faintest sweetness of late-blooming wildflowers. She followed a path that was nearly invisible among the fallen leaves, yet somehow obvious to her feet, as if her body recognized the route her mind had never learned. The forest floor was soft with decades of accumulated leaf mold, each step springy and giving kinder to her swollen ankles than any city sidewalk had been. As she walked, the forest changed character. Near the cabin, the trees were mixed maples and beeches, and the occasional pine arranged with the comfortable randomness of a woodland that had been selectively tended over centuries. But deeper in the old growth began trees that predated the Constitution, oaks whose trunks had been thick when the first Holloway woman walked this path in 1742. Their bark was deeply furrowed, creating vertical landscapes of ridge and valley that hosted entire ecosystems of moss and lichen and tiny ferns that trembled in the faintest air current. Briar paused frequently to rest her pregnancy, making the gentle uphill grade more demanding than it would otherwise have been. During one such pause, leaning against a beech tree whose smooth gray bark bore the carved initials of women she would never meet, she noticed the boundary stones Ada had described in her journal. Granite markers set at intervals along the path, each one bearing the tree emblem and a Roman numeral indicating its position in the sequence. The stones were clear of moss and debris, maintained by someone who visited regularly. By Everett's grandfather, she realized, remembering what she had not yet learned but would soon discover. 30 minutes along the path, the trees opened into a small clearing dominated by a massive red oak. Its trunk was wide enough to hide behind its branches, spreading overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. The tree was old in a way that demanded a different relationship with time. Not years old or decades old, but epochs old, a living monument that had witnessed the entire span of her family's connection to this land and regarded it as a brief episode in its own longer story. Beneath the oak lay a flat stone roughly the size of a dining table, its surface covered with flowing lines carved into the granite. The stone's position was deliberate, placed in the one spot within the clearing where morning light would strike it at the sharpest angle as the sun rose above the eastern ridge. Everything about this arrangement spoke of intention rather than accident, of design rather than discovery. Briar knelt beside it, her hands moving instinctively across the stone's cool surface. The carvings were shallow but precise, cut with tools that must have been primitive, yet guided by understanding that was anything but. She recognized topographical notation, contour lines indicating depth and elevation, arrows suggesting flow direction. This was not random decoration. This was engineering. The same language she had studied in architecture school, the universal grammar of spatial representation expressed by hands that had never seen a textbook, but understood the principles that textbooks would later codify. She waited. The morning sun climbed higher, filtering through the oak's remaining leaves at an increasingly acute angle. When the light hit the stone's surface at precisely the right degree, the carved lines seemed to deepen and clarify, not glowing as Ada's journal had poetically described, but becoming visible in a way they had not been moments before. The shallow carvings caught the angled light like channels catching water, each line suddenly sharp and readable. The effect was identical to the technique used in ancient Egyptian temples, where relief carvings invisible at midday sprang to life when the sun entered at the angle for which they were designed. Briar had studied this in her History of Architecture course. She had never expected to find it in the Appalachian Mountains, carved into granite beside a spring. Briar gasped. She was looking at a map of the entire underground water system, the 3 springs marked with circles, the aquifer below shown in sweeping curves, connecting channels rendered with the kind of precision that modern geological surveys required drilling equipment and ground-penetrating radar to achieve. Someone had mapped this system centuries ago using nothing but observation, patience, and a genius for reading the language of flowing water. Briar sat back against the oak's massive trunk, her mind racing. She pulled out the geological survey from the portfolio and compared it to the stone's map. The correlation was nearly perfect. The ancient cartographer and the modern geologist had arrived at the same conclusions through vastly different methods. The same channels, the same flow directions, the same central reservoir, represented on the survey as a cross-hatched zone of high porosity, and on the stone as a series of concentric circles that looked remarkably like a target or a heart. The spring itself bubbled from the ground nearby, clear water flowing into a pool before continuing as a stream that wound through the clearing and disappeared into the forest. Briar cupped her hands and drank. The water was cold and sweet, with a mineral complexity unlike anything from a tap or bottle. She could taste calcium and magnesium and something faintly metallic that she suspected was iron, the dissolved memory of the stone it had traveled through to reach the surface. Whether the immediate sense of well-being she felt was physiological or psychological, she could not say, but it was real. A rustling sound drew her attention. A red fox emerged from the undergrowth at the clearing's edge, its coat brilliant against the autumn browns. It regarded her with amber eyes that held none of the wariness she would have expected from a wild animal. It simply stood and looked at her, and she looked back, and for a long moment neither moved. Then it turned and vanished into the forest, silent as a thought. Briar noticed that during the entire encounter the birds had not stopped singing. The normal hush that falls when a predator appears had never occurred, as if the forest recognized the fox as something other than a threat. "The land knows its own," she whispered, recalling words from Lenora's letter. That evening, back in the cabin, Briar prepared a simple dinner from the pantry's provisions and returned to Ada's journal. But her mind kept circling back to the grimoire that Lenora's letter had mentioned. The books on the east wall, the true legacy. When moonlight began streaming through the main room's large window, Briar noticed something extraordinary. Tiny points of light appeared in the floorboards. Not reflections from outside, but emanations from within the wood itself. Fragments of quartz, she realized, leaning close. Someone had embedded tiny pieces of translucent quartz into the wooden planks at precise intervals. In daylight, they were invisible, their surfaces flush with the surrounding grain. But when moonlight struck them at the proper angle, they caught and reflected the light like earthbound stars. The pattern they formed was immediately recognizable. Cassiopeia, the seated queen. 5 points forming a perfect W shape across several floorboards. Briar knelt beside the constellation, running her fingers across each embedded crystal. The architect in her was staggered. Whoever had built this cabin had calculated the precise angle of moonlight through the window at this time of year and positioned these crystals accordingly. It was the same principle as the sentinel stone, using natural light as a revealing mechanism, requiring no technology, no electricity, no maintenance, just the eternal geometry of earth and sky. But the constellation was a key, not a destination. It pointed to something. She returned to Ada's journal, flipping rapidly through entries until she found the reference she remembered. The golden key from Mother's jewelry box fit perfectly into what appeared to be merely a knothole in the central beam. Between the journal's later pages, Briar found it. A small golden key so delicate it seemed decorative, its handle shaped like a 5-pointed star. She had assumed it was a bookmark or a keepsake. Now she understood. She examined the floorboards at the center of the constellation pattern and found the knothole. It looked like nothing, a natural imperfection in aged wood. The golden key slid in with the precision of a surgical instrument and turned with only the slightest resistance. A seam appeared in the floor. A handle emerged from what had been flat surface. Briar pulled, and a section of floorboards rose on hinges so perfectly balanced that they moved without sound. Below lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The pendant at her throat grew warm against her skin. The baby kicked once firmly. Briar took the blue-white lamp from the bedroom and began her descent, one hand supporting her belly, the other holding the light ahead of her, stepping carefully down into the hidden heart of her inheritance. The room at the bottom was at least 20 feet square, far larger than the cabin's footprint should have allowed. Another architectural trick, Briar realized. The space extended partly beneath the clearing itself, not just beneath the cabin. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, bookshelves, and storage trunks. A desk occupied the center, its surface bare except for a brass lamp that flickered to life when she said her own some mechanism of heat or proximity triggering a concealed ignition. In the far corner, partially concealed behind a tall storage trunk, she saw it now clearly, the heavy wooden door she had glimpsed the night before. A door leading to a passage that presumably emerged somewhere in the forest behind the cabin. The caretaker's entrance. The explanation for the fresh bread, the stocked pantry, the maintained fire. Someone had been coming and going through this passage for years, perhaps decades, tending the cabin in Lenora's absence. Briar made a mental note to secure this entrance. If a caretaker could use it, so could someone with less benevolent intentions. In the combined light of both lamps, she began to understand the scope of what her grandmother had hidden beneath a sagging roof and weathered timber. The filing cabinets contained financial records spanning more than a century. Stock certificates, land deeds, banking documents sorted by decade. One drawer held records for businesses. Briar had never heard her grandmother mention a sustainable forestry operation, a spring water company producing limited quantities of exceptionally pure mineral water patents for medicinal herb preparations. Each enterprise small in scale but remarkably profitable according to the meticulously maintained balance sheets. Legal papers in another cabinet. Documented conservation easements and environmental protections for the property and surrounding lands, layers of legal defense that would make development nearly impossible. Lenora had spent decades constructing a fortress of law around these 200 acres. A tall cabinet revealed hundreds of specimen bottles containing seeds, dried herbs, and soil samples. Botanical illustrations hung in preserved frames. A small safe in the corner stood ajar as if recently opened. Inside, Briar found account books for something called the Keeper's Trust, a fund specifically designated for the maintenance of the cabin and the support of its keeper. The most recent entry showed a deposit made 3 weeks before Lenora's death. The beneficiary listed was Briar Holloway, and on the bottom shelf, hidden behind other items, as if placed there for the specific person who would search thoroughly enough to find it, rested a large leather-bound book, the grimoire. Its cover bore no title, only the tree symbol, roots and branches in equal measure. Briar lifted it and felt its weight, substantial, dense, with pages heavy with centuries of accumulated knowledge. She opened the first page and found handwritten text in faded but legible ink. The Holloway Women's Record, begun in the year 1742 by Hannah Holloway, first keeper. What followed was not a book of spells, it was something far more valuable. A comprehensive archive of practical knowledge, scientific observation, medical wisdom, and environmental data, compiled by 12 generations of women who had lived on this land and studied it with the patience of centuries. Herbal remedies with dosages and indications, geological observations about the water system, weather patterns recorded across decades, agricultural techniques refined through hundreds of growing seasons, botanical classifications that predated Linnaeus, water quality measurements taken with increasing sophistication as each generation added the tools of her era. It was, Briar realized with growing awe, an irreplaceable scientific document disguised as a family heirloom. 300 years of data gathered from a single ecosystem by observers who never left and never stopped paying attention. And now it was hers. She climbed carefully back to the main floor, the grimoire heavy in her arms, the golden key warm in her palm. The hidden door closed silently behind her. The moonlight had shifted and the constellation in the floor was invisible again. Again, just planks of wood showing their age. Briar settled into the rocking chair with the grimoire open across her lap, reading by firelight as generations of women had done before her. The baby slept peacefully inside her as if she too were listening. And outside the forest murmured its approval to the stars. Judge Amos Caldwell arrived on the morning of Briar's third day at the cabin. She heard his car before she saw it. the sensible rumble of an old sedan navigating the dirt track with the careful patience of a man who had driven it many times before. Briar had been sketching the herb garden outside the kitchen window, finding unexpected pleasure in the simple activity. Her architect's hand had not held a pencil for creative purposes in months, and the return to drawing felt like rediscovering a language she had forgotten she spoke. The sound of the engine broke the meditative silence, and she set down her pencil with a faint line of apprehension tracing through her chest. Caldwell emerged from the sedan with the deliberate movements of a man whose body had begun to betray his mind's remaining sharpness. He was tall even at 78, his frame angular beneath a wool coat that had been expensive 30 years ago and now simply looked distinguished. His eyes set deep beneath brows that had turned white without losing their severity swept the clearing with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence. Beside him on the passenger seat sat a leather briefcase worn smooth at the corners from decades of faithful service. "Miss Holloway." He climbed the porch steps and extended his hand. His grip was firm, dry, and brief. "You look well. The mountain air agrees with you." "Judge Caldwell, I wasn't expecting you." "Few ever do," he replied with a trace of something that might have been humor in a less guarded. "Your grandmother appreciated my discretion and timing. I have continued the tradition in her absence." Briar noticed that he showed no surprise at the cabin's interior as she led him inside. No widened eyes at the spacious rooms, no questions about the fire burning steadily in the hearth, no comment on the impossible freshness of the air. He moved through the space like a man returning to a room he had visited 1,000 times, his hand trailing briefly along the mantel as he passed, a gesture so habitual it seemed unconscious. "You've been here before," Briar said. "It was not a question. Many times over many years." He settled at the dining table and placed the briefcase before him with the ceremonial precision of a judge opening court. "I have served as legal representative and occasional caretaker for this property since before you were born. When Lenora was in the city, someone needed to ensure the cabin's interests were protected." "The cabin's interests," Briar repeated. An unusual phrasing. His eyes crinkled at the edges, not quite a smile, but its closest relative. "Lenora would say the land has its own needs, its own rhythms. After 50 years of association, I find I cannot disagree." He opened the briefcase and removed a thick folder bound with green ribbon. "These are the complete documents your grandmother instructed me to deliver once you had spent 3 nights under this roof. She was most specific about the timing." The folder contained everything: deeds, surveys, conservation easements, water rights, mineral rights, all meticulously organized in Lenora's precise filing system. But Caldwell did not stop there. He produced a second folder, then a third, each revealing another layer of the inheritance Briar had only begun to uncover in the hidden basement. "The timber operations alone," Caldwell explained, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a man accustomed to presenting complex information to skeptical audiences, "selectively and sustainably harvested over generations, provide considerable annual income. The 3 natural springs have water purity levels exceeding any commercial source in the region. The biodiversity here has attracted research grants that feed into a conservation trust your grandmother established in 1987. He handed her a balance sheet. The figure was not the obscene wealth of her grandmother's public estate, but it represented something Briar had never possessed in her adult life: security, real, documented, legally protected financial security. "Why the secrecy?" she asked. "Why let them believe this place is worthless?" Lenora believed certain legacies reveal themselves only to those who need them truly. Caldwell's voice softened slightly, the judge giving way to something more personal. She also understood that those who seek inheritance merely for status or financial gain would misuse what this place offers. Sterling and Cordelia. Indeed. A muscle tightened along his jaw. They are already questioning the will. They have retained attorneys to research the property's hidden assets. Their investigators have filed inquiries with the county assessor's office. Briar felt a protective surge toward the cabin, toward the underground room full of centuries of knowledge, toward the springs that fed the forest and the aquifer that sustained the region. Can they challenge my ownership? They can try. Caldwell's expression hardened into something that explained why he had spent 30 years on the federal bench. Your grandmother anticipated this. The property transfer is legally impeccable. I personally insured it. He withdrew a satellite phone from the briefcase. Heavy industrial, the kind of device designed for environments where civilization's infrastructure did not reach. Cell service is non-existent here. Lenora arranged it that way, working with the county to ensure no towers were erected within range. This phone connects to a private satellite network. My number is the first contact. Use it if your cousins appear or if you need anything at all. He paused and something shifted behind his careful exterior. Something personal surfacing through the professional armor. Your grandmother saved my life, Miss Holloway. 50 years ago, I was a young attorney drowning in bourbon and bad decisions. Lenora brought me here, made me drink the spring water, walk the forest paths, sit in silence, until I could hear my own thoughts again. He looked down at his weathered hands. I owe her everything. My sobriety, my career, my judgeship. Everything I became because she showed me this place and told me to stop running from myself. He stood signaling the end of the visit with the same judicial precision that had governed its beginning. At the threshold, he paused and turned back. His faded eyes met hers directly with a warmth that pierced through decades of practiced reserve. Your grandmother spoke often of you. She believed you possessed the perfect combination of sensitivity and strength this place requires. He held her gaze for a moment that felt weighted with significance. I have served 3 generations of keepers. I look forward to serving the 4th when she arrives. His gaze dropped meaningfully to Briar's belly. Then he nodded once and walked to his car, leaving her standing in the doorway with the weight of inheritance settling across her shoulders like a mantle she had not asked for, but could no longer refuse. The crunch of tires on gravel returned 4 days later, but this time the sound carried a different quality. Aggressive. Entitled. The engines were louder, the vehicles heavier, their approach faster than the narrow track warranted. Briar was reviewing the property surveys at the dining table, cross-referencing Caldwell's documents with the maps in the hidden basement when the noise reached her. She moved to the window and felt her stomach tighten. 2 vehicles had entered the clearing. A gleaming black Range Rover followed by a silver Mercedes sedan. Even at a distance, she recognized the occupants. Cordelia stepped from the Range Rover first, her tailored pantsuit and Italian heels absurdly formal against the backdrop of forest and fallen leaves. Sterling emerged from the Mercedes, adjusting his cufflinks, surveying the property with the appraising eye of a man who had spent his career calculating the dollar value of every square foot he encountered. Briar touched the pendant at her throat. The silver warmed against her fingers, and she drew from the contact a steadiness she was not certain she possessed on her own. She opened the door before they could knock. Cordelia's hand froze mid-reach, momentarily startled. She recovered with the practiced smoothness of a woman who had spent 20 years in courtrooms. Cousin. Her smile did not reach her eyes. You look rustic. Cordelia. Sterling. Briar remained in the doorway, making no move to step aside. This is unexpected. Sterling stepped forward, arms opening for an embrace that Briar neither wanted nor reciprocated. His cologne, aggressive and expensive, invaded the clean forest air like a chemical spill. "We were concerned about you, out here all alone in your condition." "How thoughtful," Briar replied, "given that neither of you has expressed concern for my condition at any point during the preceding 8 months." Sterling's smile tightened but held. Cordelia did not bother with warmth. She brushed past Briar into the cabin, her eyes sweeping the interior with the rapid calculation of someone inventorying assets. Her expression flickered. Whatever she had expected, this was not it. The polished floors, the quality furniture, the warmth and spaciousness of rooms that should have been cramped and decaying. She ran a manicured finger along the dining table, testing for dust and finding none. "Quaint," she managed, though rather confined. Sterling followed his assessment, more openly predatory. "These old structures are liability nightmares, Briar. Wiring, foundation, roof, not to mention health hazards for a newborn." "The cabin has been meticulously maintained for generations," Briar replied, "but I appreciate your sudden concern for my child's welfare." Cordelia wasted no further time on pretense. She produced a folder from her designer handbag and spread several maps across the dining table with the efficient authority of a lawyer entering exhibits into evidence. "North Lake Development has purchased nearly everything surrounding this parcel." She pointed to color-coded boundaries that Briar recognized immediately. The development encircled her property almost completely, a noose of commerce tightening around 200 acres of old-growth forest and irreplaceable water resources. They are creating a high-end resort community, vacation homes, golf course, spa facilities, the full package, premium real estate. "They've approached all surrounding landowners with extremely generous offers." Sterling added, his tone carefully calibrated to suggest casual observation rather than calculated pressure, well above market value given the rural location. "How interesting," Briar said. "They are particularly interested in acquiring this property." Cordelia leaned forward. "Due to its central location and water resources." The words "water resources" landed in the room with the weight of revelation. They knew. Not everything, perhaps not the full extent of the aquifer, but enough. Someone had told them about the water. "We've taken the liberty of discussing preliminary terms on your behalf," Cordelia continued. "As family, we wanted to ensure you received proper value rather than being exploited in your vulnerable state." She named a figure. 6 months ago, the number would have represented unimaginable wealth to Briar. Now, knowing what lay beneath her feet, it was an insult disguised as generosity. Perhaps 1/10 of the property's true value, and that calculation accounted only for the water rights, not the timber, the biodiversity, the 3 centuries of botanical knowledge, or the conservation infrastructure Lenora had spent a lifetime constructing. "That's very generous," Briar said. Cordelia's expression shifted to triumph, the predator sensing submission. "We can handle all the paperwork. You needn't worry about a thing." "I meant it is generous of you to bring this information to my attention." Briar clarified, her voice level. "But I have no intention of selling." The cabin's temperature seemed to drop. The fire in the hearth flickered, then steadied, burning higher than before. Sterling's congenial mask dissolved, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Be reasonable, Briar. This place is worthless except for its location. You are weeks away from single motherhood with no visible means of support. My circumstances are not your concern." "We know Lenora maintained separate accounts," Cordelia said, her courtroom voice emerging fully now. "Hidden assets that should have been included in the estate distribution. Our attorneys are investigating discrepancies." "How enterprising of you." "This stubborn attachment to a worthless cabin is irrational." Cordelia's composure cracked, revealing frustration that Briar suspected had been building since the will was read. You always were Lenora's inexplicable favorite, but even she would not expect you to raise a child in primitive isolation. I believe she would expect exactly that, Briar replied. She moved toward the door and held it open, the gesture unmistakable. Now I appreciate your visit, but I have matters requiring my attention. Sterling made one last attempt, his voice dropping to the register of manufactured concern. At least consider our offer. We could arrange temporary housing until you find something suitable. The cabin is perfectly suitable, Briar said, and its worth cannot be measured in dollars. They left in a spray of gravel and exhaust, their expensive vehicles bouncing over the rough track with far less grace than they had arrived. Briar watched until they disappeared, then stood on the porch listening to the forest reassert itself, bird song, resuming, wind settling the stream, recovering its voice after the intrusion of engines and ambition. On the dining table they had left the development maps, either deliberately or in their haste. Briar studied them carefully, tracing the boundaries of the planned resort, noting how it positioned her property as a central oasis. The development did not merely surround her land, it depended on it. Without access to the water beneath her feet, the resort's golf courses would have no irrigation, its spa no mineral springs, its luxury homes no reliable water supply in a region where municipal infrastructure barely existed. Sterling and Cordelia were not simply greedy relatives seeking a larger share. They were business partners in a development deal that could not succeed without her property. They will be back, she said to the empty clearing, and next time they will not pretend to be concerned relatives. It was the following morning when Briar found the footprints. She had walked to the North Spring at dawn, carrying a glass jar to collect water, as she had begun doing each morning. Finding that the mineral-rich water eased her pregnancy symptoms better than any supplement she had tried. The path was familiar now, her feet finding the invisible trail without conscious effort. But near the spring the ground told a different story. Boot prints, large and heavy, pressed into the soft earth around the pool. Someone had been here during the night. They had collected samples. She could see the circular impressions where containers had been set down, and they had attempted to access a small geological formation near the spring's source, scraping away moss and soil to expose the rock beneath. Briar knelt beside the prints, her heart hammering. These were not old tracks. The edges were sharp, the compressed earth still damp. Whoever had been here had come within hours of her visit. She thought of Cordelia's words, water resources. They had known. And now they were gathering evidence, building a case, preparing for whatever legal assault would come next. Briar used the satellite phone to call Judge Caldwell. His voice, even filtered through satellite relay, carried its characteristic precision. Document everything, he instructed. Photograph the prints, the sample collection sites, any disturbance. I will file a trespassing complaint immediately. A pause. And Briar, be careful. Sterling has connections in county government. This may escalate beyond simple family disputes. 2 days later, Briar drove into the small town of Hollow Creek for the first time. She needed supplies. The pantry could not provide batteries for a flashlight, a notebook for the observations she had begun recording, and prenatal vitamins that no mysterious kitchen could stock. The town was barely a town, a main street with a general store, a post office, a church with a steeple that had lost its paint to decades of weather, and at the far end, tucked between a hardware store and a shuttered barber shop, a bookstore. The sign above the door read, Holloway Books, and beneath it in smaller letters, rare and antiquarian volumes since 1962. Briar stood on the sidewalk staring at the name. Holloway, her name, her family name on a bookshop in a town she had never visited. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The interior smelled of aged paper and binding glue, and the particular warmth that accumulates in rooms where books have been loved for decades. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, crammed with volumes arranged in a system that probably made sense to exactly one person. That person emerged from the back room carrying a stack of leather-bound journals. He was roughly 40, with dark hair graying at the temples and the lean, slightly hunched frame of someone who spent more time reading than eating. Wire-rimmed glasses sat on a narrow nose. His eyes, when they found Briar's, held recognition. "You must be Briar," he said, setting down the journals with careful precision. "I've been expecting you. I'm Everett Holloway." The name struck her like a bell. Holloway, distant branch. His smile was warm but carried something guarded beneath it. "Very distant, technically. Your grandmother and my grandfather were cousins. Different lines of the same tree, you might say." He gestured around the shop. "Lenora helped me establish this place. She believed the family's history deserved a proper archive, and I had the academic temperament for it. I have genealogical records going back to Hannah in 1742. They talked for 2 hours. Everett brewed tea from herbs he kept in a cabinet behind the register, and Briar found herself relaxing in his presence in a way she had not relaxed around another person since Lenora's death. He knew things about the family history that complemented the grimoire's entries, context, and connections that the book's practical focus had omitted. He helped her understand the significance of the boundary stones mentioned in several grimoire entries. He explained the relationship between the 3 springs and the geological formations that fed them. He showed her historical photographs of the cabin from different eras, each one revealing modifications made by successive keepers. "Your grandmother was the most systematic keeper in the family's history," Everett said, showing her a photograph of Lenora as a young woman standing on the cabin's porch. Her hair dark, her posture already carrying the authority that would later command boardrooms. She modernized the financial structures, established the conservation trusts, and built the business network that protects the property. Everything the previous keepers did through tradition and instinct, Lenora formalized through law and commerce. Briar studied the photograph, seeing her grandmother not as the elegant matriarch she remembered, but as a young woman not much older than Briar herself, standing at the beginning of a responsibility that would define her entire life. "I need your help with something," Briar said. "The grimoire references techniques and plant species I can't identify. Some of the older entries use terminology I don't recognize." "Bring it to me," Everett said. "I've spent 20 years building a reference library specifically for interpreting Holloway family documents." Briar returned to the bookshop 3 times over the following week. Each visit deepened her understanding of the property and its history. Everett was patient, knowledgeable, and genuinely passionate about the family's legacy. He seemed in every way to be exactly the ally she needed. Until the afternoon she found the map. She had been browsing the shop's back room while Everett prepared tea, looking for a particular botanical reference he had mentioned. On his desk beneath a stack of unrelated papers, the corner of a document caught her eye. She would not have looked twice except for the familiar topographical lines, the curves of the aquifer, the positions of the 3 springs. She pulled it free. It was a photocopy of the geological survey from the cabin's hidden basement, the same document she had found in Lenora's desk compartment, identical in every detail. Across the top in red ink someone had written a notation: North Lake Development Meeting, August 15th. The date was 6 weeks ago, before Lenora died. Briar's hands went cold. She replaced the document exactly as she had found it and returned to the main room where Everett was pouring tea and discussing the medicinal properties of black cohosh with the enthusiasm of someone who had never betrayed anyone in his life. She said nothing, She smiled. She drank the tea. And when she left the bookshop that afternoon, she carried with her a weight far heavier than the books in her bag. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the rocking chair beside the dying fire, the pendant cold against her chest. For the first time since she had put it on and tried to assemble the pieces into a picture she could bear to look at. Everett had copied the geological survey. He had shared it with North Lake Development. The information Sterling and Cordelia possessed about the water resources information that should have been known only to Breyer and Judge Caldwell had come from the man she had been trusting with the family's most sensitive historical documents. The next morning, Breyer returned to the bookshop. Everett looked up from his desk with his usual warm smile, and she placed the photocopy on the counter between them. The smile died. "How long have you been feeding them information?" Breyer asked. To his credit, he did not deny it. The color drained from his face, but he met her eyes. He sat down, slowly removed his glasses, and pressed his fingers against his closed eyelids for a long moment. 8 months, he said finally. Since before Lenora's death. Why? The word hung between in the dusty air. Because I am also a Holloway. His voice cracked on the name. My grandfather was Lenora's cousin. He was a Holloway by blood, by birthright, by every measure except the one that mattered. He was male, and in your family's tradition that meant he was nothing. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the main street of a town that bore his family's name on a bookshop he could barely afford to keep open. I grew up knowing about the cabin, about the land, about the keeper tradition. My grandfather told me everything before he died, the springs, the grimoire, the underground room. He knew because his mother told him, just as her mother told her. But the knowledge came with a locked door. He could know about it. He could never be part of it. So you sold us out, Breyer said, for money. $5,000. He almost laughed. That is what 3 centuries of bitterness costs, apparently. $5,000 from a development company that would bulldoze every tree on that land without losing a minute of sleep. And Sterling. He learned about the hidden accounts from you. Sterling's investigators found public records that suggested Lenora maintained assets beyond her declared estate. I confirmed their suspicions and provided details about the water resources. I told myself I was correcting an injustice, that the Holloway legacy should not be hoarded by one branch of the family while the others scrape by. His voice hardened. Do you know what it is like to carry a name that opens no doors to watch from outside while your relatives inherit empires you helped build? My grandfather maintained those boundary stones for 40 years. He walked the property monthly, checking for trespassers, repairing damage. Lenora paid him nothing, acknowledged him never. Breyer listened without interrupting. The baby shifted inside her, pressing against her ribs as if trying to get closer to the conversation. I understand your anger, she said when he finished. I understand the injustice, but you did not correct it. You put 200 acres of irreplaceable forest and a water source that sustains 3 counties into the hands of people who will destroy it for profit. Everett flinched as if she had struck him. I know, he whispered. I knew it when I did it. I told myself it was justice, but I knew. Breyer took the photocopy from the counter, folded it, and placed it in her pocket. She looked at Everett for a long time, seeing in his face not an enemy but a mirror of herself, someone who had been excluded and diminished and driven to desperate choices by a system that valued bloodline over character. I am not going to pretend this did not happen, she said, but I am not going to destroy you either. What I need from you now is honesty, complete honesty. What exactly did you tell them, and what are they planning to do with it? Everett told her everything. The meetings with North Lake Development, the information he had provided. the connections between Sterling and the county commissioner, who controlled zoning and land use decisions, and finally the detail that transformed a family dispute into a genuine crisis. "Sterling is pushing for eminent domain," Everett said, and the words fell into the room like stones into still water. "He has contacts on the county commission. He is arguing that the resort development represents sufficient public economic benefit to justify condemning your property for acquisition." Breyer felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Eminent domain. The government's power to seize private property for public use. It was the nuclear option of property law, rarely deployed against individual landowners, but devastatingly effective when it was. Conservation easements, water rights, even Lenora's careful legal fortifications might not withstand it if the political will existed. She called Judge Caldwell from the satellite phone that evening, standing on the cabin's porch under a sky thick with stars. "Eminent domain." His voice carried a weight she had not heard before. "That is the heaviest weapon in American property law. If Sterling has the county commission's support, this becomes a different kind of fight entirely." A long pause, the silence of a man assembling strategy from decades of judicial experience. "We need to prepare for a real battle, Breyer, not a family disagreement, a war." The storm announced itself 3 days later. Breyer had been studying the grimoire's weather section, which contained observations spanning nearly 3 centuries. Multiple entries described sudden autumn tempests in the Hollow Creek Valley, violent systems that formed when cold mountain air collided with warm moisture from the south. The storms arrived approximately once per decade, according to the records, clearing deadwood from the forest floor and replenishing groundwater reserves. A necessary violence that served a larger purpose. The passage that caught her attention most had been written by Ada in 1932. "The warning stone by the hearth grows warm before significant weather changes. When truly hot to touch, seek shelter immediately and prepare for extended isolation." Breyer moved to the fireplace and found the stone Ada had described. Larger than the others, marked with faint spiral carvings, it radiated heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She held her palm against it and felt warmth that seemed to pulse with a rhythm separate from the flames. Geothermal activity, she reasoned. The underground water system responding to atmospheric pressure changes heat rising through the stone foundation as the aquifer adjusted. A natural barometer built into the cabin's structure by people who understood the relationship between earth and sky. By late afternoon, the western horizon had darkened to purple-black. Wind whipped through the trees, stripping leaves and bending trunks. Breyer moved methodically through the cabin, securing shutters, bringing in firewood, checking the root cellar behind the kitchen pantry where emergency supplies were stored with the same meticulous organization Lenora applied to everything. She descended to the hidden basement and secured the caretaker's door with the heavy iron bolts she found beside it, ensuring no one could enter from the outside passage during the storm. The first raindrops struck as she latched the final shutter. Within minutes, the rain became a wall of water. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that vibrated in her teeth. And then the cabin door shook, not from wind, from impact. Someone striking the wood with a fist, the sound barely audible above the storm's fury. Breyer froze. She was alone, miles from any neighbor in a storm that made the roads impassable. No one should have been able to reach her. No one should have tried. She approached the door cautiously, placing her hand against the wood. Through the thick oak, she felt vibration. Another impact, then another, and between the blows, a voice she could not quite hear. She opened the door to the full force of the storm. 2 men stood on the porch, strangers. Large rain soaked their clothing, dark and practical. One carried a crowbar. The other held a flashlight aimed at her face, blinding her momentarily. "Evening, ma'am." "The one with the flashlight," said his voice, carrying false politeness that did not match his eyes. "Storm caught us on the road. Mind if we come inside?" The crowbar told the real story. So did their boots caked with mud that matched the particular red-brown clay of the hillside behind the cabin. They had not come from the main track. They had come from behind the structure, from the direction of the external passage to the hidden basement. She had bolted the underground entrance only hours ago. They must have tried it first, found it secured, and come around to the front. "What did you take?" Briar asked, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her veins. The men exchanged a glance. The one with the crowbar stepped forward, and Briar saw what he carried under his other arm pressed against his body, beneath a waterproof jacket. The grimoire. They had broken in through the external passage before she had bolted it. They had been in the basement while she was upstairs securing shutters. They had taken the book and tried to leave the way they came, only to find the bolt thrown. The porch was their exit, not their entrance. "Ma'am, we don't want any trouble," the flashlight man said. "We were hired to retrieve some documents. We've got what we came for. Just step aside and we will be on our way." Briar blocked the doorway. 8 months pregnant, unarmed, alone in a storm, facing 2 men who had broken into her home and stolen 3 centuries of her family's accumulated knowledge. "That book belongs to this land," she said. "It belongs to every woman who wrote in it. It belongs to whoever pays us," the crowbar man replied, and pushed past her. She grabbed for the grimoire. Her fingers caught the edge of the waterproof jacket, pulling it open. The man shoved her backward, not violently, but firmly, the way someone moves an obstacle rather than attacks a person. Briar stumbled against the doorframe, her back striking the carved stone pane, shooting through her spine and wrapping around her belly. The men disappeared into the storm. She heard an engine start somewhere beyond the tree line, a vehicle she had not seen parked on an approach route. She now realized connected to the external basement passage. Headlights swept briefly through the rain, then vanished. Briar stood in the doorway, rain soaking her nightgown, her back throbbing, her hands empty. The grimoire was gone. 280 years of knowledge, every remedy, every observation, every name and date and hard-won wisdom carried into the darkness by men who neither knew nor cared what they had taken. She closed the door and locked it, and stood with her forehead pressed against the wood, breathing in shallow gasps. The baby kicked frantically, responding to the adrenaline coursing through her mother's blood. The first contraction came 30 minutes later. She recognized it immediately. Not the Braxton Hicks practice contractions she had been experiencing for weeks, but the real thing. Deep, purposeful, originating in her lower back, and radiating forward with a grinding pressure that demanded her full attention. "No," she whispered. "Not now, not yet." At 36 weeks, the baby was technically full term, but Briar had counted on 4 more weeks, 4 weeks to prepare, to arrange for medical care, to drive to the nearest hospital 2 hours away on roads that were now underwater. The satellite phone sat on the kitchen counter. She grabbed it and pressed the first contact. Static. The storm was interfering with the satellite signal, thick clouds blocking the narrow window of sky the antenna needed. Another contraction gripped her stronger than the first, bending her over the counter with a gasp. When it released, she counted. 15 minutes since the last one. Active labor, but early. She had time. Maybe. She tried the phone again. Nothing but the empty hiss of a signal searching for a satellite it could not find. The roads were impassable. The phone was dead. The grimoire, with its detailed sections on childbirth written by women who had delivered babies in this very room for 3 centuries, was gone. Stolen. Carried into the storm by men who worked for her cousin. Briar was alone. She moved through this cabin on autopilot, her body responding to instincts she did not know she possessed. She gathered towels, heated water, positioned the oil lamp in the bedroom. In the panel beside the wardrobe, the one that had revealed itself on her first night, she found the birthing supplies Lenora had prepared. Receiving blankets, sterile cord-cutting kit, herbal preparations labeled in her grandmother's handwriting. Everything medically appropriate. Everything precisely what she would need. Another contraction arrived and she wrote it out, gripping the bedpost, breathing in patterns she had learned from a prenatal class she had attended alone because Weston had already left by then. The bronze bell hung from its hook on this front porch. Lenora's letter had mentioned it in a line Briar had initially overlooked. When truly needed, ring the bell, Nell Harlan will hear. Between contractions, Briar made her way to the porch. The storm screamed around her, rain driving sideways, trees bending nearly horizontal in the wind. She grasped the bell and rang it once, putting into the motion every ounce of need her body contained. The sound should have been swallowed by the storm. Instead, it carried clear and resonant, cutting through wind and rain, with a purity that seemed to exist on a different frequency than the surrounding chaos. 20 minutes later, a knock came at the door. Gentle this time, not the violent hammering of the intruders, but the patient rap of someone who had arrived exactly when needed. Someone who can help, the voice said when Briar called out, female, elderly, certain. You rang the bell, did you not? Nell Harlan stood on the porch, remarkably composed for a 73-year-old woman who had just walked 3 miles through a catastrophic storm. Her silver-white hair was tied back beneath an oilskin hood. She carried a leather medical bag in one hand and a bundle of herbs in the other. Her boots were muddy, but her eyes were clear bright with the particular alertness of someone who has spent a lifetime arriving at moments exactly like this one. The old paths through the forest follow the ridgeline, she said, entering the cabin and shedding her wet outer layer with practiced efficiency. They do not flood because the drainage was engineered by people who understood water the way your family understands it. 3 miles uphill mostly, but my knees still work when they need to. She assessed Briar with a single sweeping glance that encompassed medical evaluation, emotional state, and the overall readiness of the birthing environment. Active labor, contractions 12 minutes apart. Your water hasn't broken yet. She set down her bag and washed her hands at the kitchen basin with the herbal soap, scrubbing with the thoroughness of someone with proper medical training. I attended your grandmother's birth in this room. I attended your mother's birth at the city hospital, which Lenora permitted against my advice. And now your daughter. The grimoire Briar managed between contractions. They stole it. I don't have the birthing instructions. Nell looked at her with an expression that was equal parts compassion and iron. The knowledge is not in the book, Briar. It never was. The book is a record of what these women already knew. She placed her hands on Briar's shoulders, firm and grounding. Your body carries 300 years of memory in its blood and bone. You do not need pages. You need to trust what you already are. The storm raged through the night. Inside the cabin, time lost its ordinary shape and became something measured only in contractions and the spaces between them. Nell moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had shepherded hundreds of women through this passage, coaching Briar's breathing, applying counter-pressure to her lower back, preparing herbal infusions that eased the pain without dulling the awareness. Between contractions, Nell talked. Not to distract, but to connect, weaving Briar into the fabric of women who had labored in this same room before her. Your grandmother cursed in French, Nell said, pressing a warm cloth against Briar's lower back. I didn't know she spoke French until that night. She held onto the bedpost just as you're doing now, and said things that would have scandalized the Académie Française. Afterwards, she denied it entirely. Said I must have been hearing things. Your grandmother was a magnificent liar when it suited her. Briar almost laughed, but the next contraction arrived and laughter became Ada, your great-grandmother, she sang, Nell continued. My mother told me. Ada sang hymns through her entire labor, not because she was religious, but because the rhythm of the music matched the rhythm of the contractions, and her body needed structure to work within. She had a beautiful voice, my mother said. Even in pain, even at the extremity of human experience, her voice found the melody and held it. What did your mother's mother do? Briar asked during a brief respite, genuinely wanting to know. The Harlan women, what were their labors like? Nell's eyes softened. It was the first personal question Briar had asked her, and it landed somewhere deep. My grandmother delivered 4 children in a farmhouse 6 miles from here without anyone's help at all. She said labor was like weather. You couldn't control it. You couldn't hurry it. You could only decide to be in it fully or fight it and lose. She chose fully, and she taught my mother the same who taught me. Every keeper has stood where you stand tonight, Nell said during a later respite, her weathered hands wrapping warm cloths around Briar's feet. Every one of them said what you are about to say. The next contraction built like a wave gathering height before it breaks. Briar gripped the bedpost and felt the sound torn from her throat before she could shape it into words. I can't do this. Nell nodded as if the words were a checkpoint on a familiar road. Every Holloway woman has said exactly that, and every single one of them was wrong. Hours passed. The storm weakened its fury, spending itself against the mountains and dissolving into steady rain that drummed on the roof with the persistence of a heartbeat. The contractions strengthened, the intervals between them shrinking as if the spaces were being compressed by the same force that was opening her body. Briar moved between positions as Nell directed, standing, kneeling, squatting, each posture serving the baby's slow descent. The pain was transformative, obliterating everything except the present moment and the ancient purpose it served. She found herself gripping the silver pendant during the worst of it, the tree emblem pressing into her palm hard enough to leave an impression. The metal was warm, warmer than body heat alone could explain, and in her pain-altered state, she imagined she could feel it pulsing, matching the rhythm of her contractions as if the pendant itself were breathing with her. At some point, she became aware that the sounds of the storm outside and the sounds of her own body had merged into a single composition. Rain and breathing, thunder and the low moan that rose from somewhere beneath her conscious mind, wind and the whispered encouragements Nell offered with the steady cadence of a prayer. I can see the head, Nell announced, her professional composure cracking just slightly to reveal wonder beneath. She has your grandmother's brow, that same furrow of determination. Briar felt the final contraction building different from all the others, carrying with it the unmistakable compulsion to push that no amount of preparation could have adequately described. She surrendered to it completely, channeling every ounce of strength she possessed. Every loss she had survived, every mile of the road that had brought her to this cabin in the wilderness. Dawn was breaking outside. The first gray light seeped through the cracks in the shutters. With a final push that seemed to reach down through the floorboards and into the ancient water table beneath, Briar felt the release. The sudden, extraordinary sensation of separation and completion occurring simultaneously. And then a cry. Lusty, outraged, magnificent. Her daughter's first breath drawn in a room where 12 generations of Holloway women had drawn theirs. A perfect girl, Nell said, placing the infant on Briar's chest. Born at dawn, born with the storm's passing, born exactly as she was meant to be. Briar looked down at her daughter's face. Tiny features contorted with the fury of arrival, fists clenched against the cold new world, and felt the word she had been searching for since she first turned the iron key in the cabin's lock. Home. Not a place, not a building, not even 200 acres of irreplaceable forest and water. Home was this weight on her chest, this small, fierce body demanding warmth, and safety and love. Home was the choice to stay and fight for what mattered. Home was the line of women stretching backward through centuries and forward through the child now breathing against her heart. Lenora, Briar whispered. Her name is Lenora Wren Holloway. The baby opened her eyes. They were dark, darker than newborn blue, almost violet in the dawn light. She looked up at her mother with an intensity that transcended her minutes of existence. And Briar looked back, and between them passed a recognition that required no words, and would require none for years to come. Outside, the last clouds dissolved. Sunlight poured through the shutters in golden bands, and somewhere in the clearing a bird began to sing, and then another and another, until the forest itself seemed to be welcoming the newest keeper of Hollow Creek into the world she had inherited simply by arriving in it. The days following Lenora Wren's birth passed in a rhythm older than clocks. Sleep and waking blurred into a continuous flow, governed entirely by the infant's needs. Her small cries arriving at intervals that seemed random, but carried their own logic, the ancient timetable of hunger and warmth, and the simple desire to be held. Nell Harlan stayed for 5 days. She slept on the sofa in the main room, rising before dawn to prepare herbal infusions for Briar's recovery, and checking the baby with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had been examining newborns for half a century. Her hands, weathered and strong, moved over the infant with a tenderness that contradicted their roughness, the same way old trees produce the softest moss. "You are recovering remarkably well," Nell observed on the 5th morning, her fingers pressing gently along Briar's abdomen to assess the uterine contraction. "The women in your line have always healed quickly after childbirth. The spring water helps. The minerals in it match almost exactly what your body needs to rebuild." Briar nodded, cradling Lenora Wren against her shoulder. The baby nursed with ferocious concentration and slept with absolute surrender between feedings, a pattern that left Briar exhausted but strangely peaceful. The persistent anxiety that had lived in her chest for months, the constant hum of financial terror and emotional abandonment, had been replaced by something simpler and more demanding. Her daughter needed her. Everything else could wait. Almost everything. "I should be able to return home tomorrow," Nell said, wrapping dried herbs into paper bundles and labeling each in her careful script. "You have mastered the essentials. The cabin will provide what else you need." Briar caught her hand. "I cannot thank you enough. I do not know how I would have managed." The old midwife smiled, the creases around her eyes deepening into well-worn channels. "You would have managed beautifully. The knowledge lives in your blood." She paused, and the smile shifted into something more serious. "But there is a harder task ahead of you than childbirth, Briar. You know that." The grimoire, Sterling, the eminent domain threat, the stolen book that could be used to paint Lenora Holloway as a delusional old woman who left her most valuable asset to a granddaughter, equally unfit to possess it. "I know," Briar said. Nell departed the next morning, walking into the forest with the same quiet certainty with which she had arrived, her medical bag in one hand and a bundle of dried rosemary in the other. At the edge of the clearing, she turned back. "When Everett was a boy," she said, "he used to come to my cottage and help me sort herbs. He was gentle then. Angry, but gentle. Whatever he has done, remember that the anger came first. The betrayal was its child, not its parent. Then she was gone, absorbed by the trees, as if the forest had opened to receive her and closed again behind." Briar stood on the porch, holding her daughter, watching the space where Nell had disappeared. Lenora Wren was awake, her dark eyes tracking something in the tree line that Briar could not see. The baby made a soft sound, not a cry, but a vocalization of interest, as if greeting a familiar presence. The satellite phone's signal returned on the 7th day after the birth. Breyer dialed Judge Caldwell's number and heard it ring once before his voice came through, stripped of all judicial reserve. "Thank God. I have been trying to reach you for 5 days." She told him everything. The birth, the stolen grimoire, the men who had entered through the external basement passage before she bolted it, taken the book and emerged through the cabin when they found their exit blocked. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, the silence that followed had the quality of a man organizing a legal response, the way a general organizes a campaign. "They have moved faster than I anticipated," he said finally. "Sterling filed his petition with the county commission 3 days ago. The eminent domain proceeding is scheduled for preliminary hearing in 6 weeks." Another pause, heavier. "And there's more. Cordelia has filed a separate action in family court." "What kind of action?" "A petition questioning your fitness as a parent. She alleges that you gave birth without medical supervision in an isolated location without electricity or running water. She claims the living conditions at the cabin constitute endangerment of a minor." The words landed in Breyer's stomach like stones dropped into deep water. She looked at Lenora Wren sleeping in the cradle, her tiny fists curled beside her face, her breathing so light it was barely visible. "She is trying to take my daughter. She is trying to create leverage." Caldwell corrected, his voice hardening. "The custody threat is a pressure tactic designed to force you to the negotiating table. If she can demonstrate that the cabin is unfit for a child, she undermines your reason for staying. And if you have no reason to stay, the eminent domain proceeding becomes simple. What do we do?" "We fight on both fronts simultaneously." The judge's voice carried the cold clarity of a man who had spent 30 years on the federal bench and understood exactly how the machinery of law could be weaponized. "I am coming to the cabin tomorrow. We have much to prepare." Caldwell arrived at noon the following day, carrying 2 briefcases instead of 1, and accompanied by a woman Breyer had not met, Dr. Marion Ashcroft, an environmental attorney from Charlottesville, whose reputation, Caldwell explained, preceded her in every courtroom in the state. "Marion has successfully defended 4 eminent domain cases in Virginia alone," Caldwell said, settling at the dining table with the gravity of a man convening a tribunal. "She understands the intersection of property rights and environmental protection better than anyone currently practicing." Dr. Ashcroft was 50 compact and radiated the focused intensity of someone who had chosen her battles carefully and won most of them. She shook Breyer's hand with a grip that communicated competence rather than warmth, then immediately began reviewing the property documents with the speed of a woman who billed by the quarter hour even when she was working pro bono, which she informed Breyer she was. "Lenora retained me 15 years ago to prepare for exactly this scenario," Ashcroft explained, spreading survey maps across the table. "She knew the aquifer's value would eventually attract predators. She spent the last decade of her life constructing legal defenses specifically designed to withstand eminent domain." "Are they sufficient?" Breyer asked. Ashcroft looked up from the maps with an expression that was honest rather than reassuring. "They are formidable, but eminent domain is political as much as legal. If the county commission votes to condemn, we fight it in court. We can win. But the fight will be expensive, public, and brutal." "Sterling has the commission," Caldwell added. 3 of the 5 commissioners have received campaign contributions from North Lake Development. The chairman plays golf with Sterling every Thursday. Breyer felt the familiar cold weight of powerlessness settling into her chest. The same sensation she had felt when Weston left, when the firm laid her off, when the landlord showed her apartment to strangers while she was still packing. But then Lenora Wren made a sound from the cradle, a small questioning noise, and the weight shifted, not disappeared, shifted, redistributed across a foundation that had not existed before her daughter's birth. "What about the grimoire?" Briar asked. "Sterling has it. What will he do with it?" Caldwell and Ashcroft exchanged a glance that told Briar they had already discussed this. "He will use it as evidence in both proceedings," Caldwell said carefully. "The book contains extensive sections on herbal medicine, traditional remedies, weather prediction through natural observation, and family rituals that a hostile attorney could characterize as superstition or mental instability. He will argue that Lenora was not of sound mind when she executed the will," Ashcroft continued. "A book full of folk remedies and nature rituals written across generations presented to a jury by a skilled lawyer becomes evidence that the Holloway women have a hereditary tendency toward irrational belief. He does not need to prove it. He needs only to create enough doubt." "And the custody petition uses the same material," Caldwell finished. "Cordelia will argue that you are continuing a pattern of unstable behavior by raising your daughter in conditions she will describe as primitive and isolated, guided by a book of superstitions rather than modern parenting." Briar sat very still, feeling the architecture of the trap. Two legal proceedings, each reinforcing the other. The eminent domain action threatened the land. The custody action threatened her daughter. Together they formed a vice designed to crush her from both directions, simultaneously forcing a settlement that would hand Sterling the aquifer and Cordelia the satisfaction of having won. "We need to neutralize the custody petition independently," Ashcroft said, already making notes. "Nell Harlan, your midwife, does she hold any medical certifications?" "She mentioned proper medical training," Briar recalled. "Good. We will need her testimony that the birth was attended by a qualified practitioner. Additionally, I recommend installing a solar power system and water filtration unit before the hearing. Not because the cabin needs them, but because a family court judge needs to see modern amenities when evaluating living conditions." Ashcroft's pen moved with surgical precision across her notepad. "The goal is to make Cordelia's characterization of primitive isolation look like exactly what it is. A fabrication designed to serve a property dispute." "I need that book back," Briar said quietly. Caldwell nodded. "We are working on that as well, but the legal channels for recovery of the grimoire are slow, and Sterling's attorneys will delay at every opportunity." What the legal channels could not provide, Everett Holloway delivered. The package arrived 11 days after Caldwell's visit, carried into the Hollow Creek post office by the regular mail carrier, and placed on the counter with no more ceremony than any other parcel. It was a small brown package with no return address, addressed to Briar Holloway in handwriting she recognized. Everett's angular academic script, slightly less precise than usual, as if the hand that wrote it had been unsteady. Inside the parcel, wrapped in a clean cotton cloth, was the grimoire. Briar stood in the post office, holding the book against her chest, its familiar weight and warmth returning to her like a missing limb restored. The leather cover bore new scuffs and a water stain along one edge, but the pages inside were intact. Every entry, every remedy, every name and date and observation preserved. Tucked inside the front cover was a scrap of paper torn from a yellow legal pad. The handwriting was Everett's, but barely legible. The letters formed with obvious difficulty. "I am also a Holloway. This is how I prove it." Briar drove to the county jail that afternoon. Lenora Wren, secured in a car seat she had purchased in town with money from the Keeper's Trust. The jail was 40 minutes east, a low concrete building that smelled of disinfectant and institutional despair. Everett sat behind the plexiglass partition, looking diminished. His left eye was swollen shut, mottled purple and green. His right arm hung in a sling. The wire-rimmed glasses were gone, replaced by a crack running across his vision that no one had bothered to repair. "They caught me on camera," he said, his voice flattened by pain, and the particular humiliation of confinement. I waited until Cordelia's office was closed for the weekend, got in through a window, found the grimoire in her office safe. Combination was her birthday, which tells you everything about her security instincts. A ghost of his old humor surfaced and died. I made it to the post office before Sterling's people caught up with me on Route 19. They did this to you. 2 men. Same ones who took the book from the cabin, I suspect. Professional. Efficient. He touched his swollen eye with his free hand. I did not tell them where I sent it. They were not gentle in their inquiry. Briar pressed her palm against the plexiglass. On the other side, Everett pressed his against it, their hands separated by an inch of transparent barrier and decades of family injustice. The charge is breaking and entering, he said. Cordelia is pushing for maximum sentencing, 6 months probably. My public defender says I should plead guilty and take the deal. I will get you a proper attorney, Briar said, and Judge Caldwell is already working on a motion to reclassify the charge. The grimoire was stolen property taken from my cabin by hired men who committed breaking and entering themselves. You were recovering stolen goods. The legal distinction matters. Everett's one working eye widened slightly. He had not considered this angle, or perhaps had not dared to hope for it. That is not why I did it. His gaze found hers, and in it she saw something she recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror. The desperate need to belong to something larger than your own small, damaged life. I did it because the grimoire belongs in the cabin, because 300 years of women's knowledge should not be used as a weapon against the women who created it, and because my grandfather spent 40 years protecting that land without ever being thanked. And I spent 8 months betraying it, and the math did not balance. When you get out, Briar said, and the when was deliberate, not if. There is a position managing the sustainable forestry program. The Holloway legacy belongs to every Holloway. I am changing the tradition. Something broke open in Everett's face. Not tears, though his one working eye glistened. Something deeper. The particular fracture that occurs when a person who has resigned themselves to permanent exclusion is suddenly, unexpectedly invited in. That evening, Briar sat at the dining table with the grimoire open before her, reading the final pages she had not reached before the theft. Lenora Wren slept in the cradle nearby, her breathing a soft metronome against the cabin's deeper silences. Lenora's handwriting filled the last written pages. Not instructions about the property or the springs or the business operations. Something personal. Something that had been waiting for Briar to be ready to receive it. For Briar, when she has survived the fire and emerged carrying new life, I must tell you something that may cause you pain, but which you deserve to know, because the tradition of this family has included too much secrecy. And secrecy, I have learned, is a form of control that dishonors those it claims to protect. 30 years ago, when my businesses failed and my debts exceeded my assets, and the world I had built in the city collapsed around me, I nearly sold the cabin. Yes, I, Lenora Holloway, 12th keeper guardian of 3 centuries of tradition, nearly sold every acre to a water extraction company for a fraction of its value because I was afraid and exhausted and could not see past my own desperation. I had the papers drawn up. I signed the preliminary agreement. I was 3 days from closing when Amos Caldwell drove to the cabin and refused to leave until I listened to him. He did not argue with me. He did not lecture. He simply drove me here and told me to stay for 1 month before making a final decision. He said that if after 30 days in the cabin I still wanted to sell, he would notarize the documents himself. I lasted 4 days before I burned the papers in the fireplace. The cabin reminded me, not through magic or mystery, but through the simple fact of its existence. the water running beneath my feet, the trees standing where they had stood for centuries, the names in the grimoire, women who had faced worse than bankruptcy and chosen this land over easier lives. I am telling you this because the family mythology says the keepers are extraordinary women of unusual strength and wisdom. This is a lie. We are ordinary women who made difficult choices, sometimes poorly, sometimes at great cost, and occasionally with grace. I was not strong when I nearly sold the cabin. I was not wise when I chose financial empire over honest stewardship for 20 years. I was not brave when I kept Everett's family at arm's length because tradition told me the male line had no place in our legacy. I was human, flawed and frightened and frequently wrong. I chose you as my successor not because you are perfect, Briar, but because you are honest. You have never hidden from your own weaknesses. You have never pretended to be more than you are. In a family that has survived through secrecy, you are the first keeper who might have the courage to be transparent. Amos Caldwell saved this legacy by saving me from myself. He is the finest man I have ever known, and I never told him that which is one of many regrets I carry into whatever comes next. Guard the land, teach your daughter, and for God's sake, do what I could not. Open the doors I kept closed. This legacy is diminished by every person it excludes. With all my love and my complete confidence in your judgment, even when your judgment terrifies me, Grandma Lenora. Briar lowered the pages. The fire crackled. The baby slept. Outside wind moved through the forest, carrying the sound of water over stone, the same sound that had accompanied every keeper's most private moments for nearly 300 years. She thought about Lenora, not the formidable matriarch, not the shrewd businesswoman, not the keeper of traditions, but the frightened woman who had almost sold everything and been saved by a man who loved her enough to drive into the wilderness and sit with her in silence until she remembered who she was. She thought about Caldwell, 50 years of service to a woman and a legacy that he believed in completely and possessed no claim to. A man who had found his own salvation in these woods and spent the rest of his life protecting them, not as keeper, but as guardian, holding the door for women who carried a responsibility he could share but never own. And she thought about Everett, beaten and jailed for stealing back what had been stolen from her. A man from the excluded branch of her family carrying the same blood and the same love for this land, but denied by tradition any legitimate place in its future. The tradition was wrong. Lenora knew it. She had lacked the courage to change it. She was asking Briar to be braver than she had been. The weeks before the hearing passed with the focused intensity of a military campaign. Dr. Ashcroft visited the cabin twice, each time bringing new documentation and departing with assignments for Briar. A solar panel system was installed on the cabin's south-facing roof, providing electricity for the first time in the structure's 3-century history. A water filtration unit connected to the North Springs pipe system that Briar discovered running beneath the cabin floor provided certified potable water. Nell Harlan submitted a sworn affidavit confirming her credentials as a certified nurse, midwife with 37 years of practice and documenting the medical details of Lenora Wren's delivery. Caldwell, meanwhile, pursued Everett's defense with the methodical ferocity of a judge who understood the system's machinery from the inside. He argued successfully that the grimoire constituted stolen property taken from Briar's cabin by hired individuals who had themselves committed breaking and entering. Everett's action, while technically illegal, was an attempt to recover documented stolen goods. The charge was reduced from felony breaking and entering to misdemeanor trespass. The sentence was reduced to 90 days with credit for time served. Everett would be released in just over 2 months. The preliminary hearing on the eminent domain petition was held 6 weeks after Lenora Wren's birth at the county courthouse in Marshall, Virginia. a red brick building with white columns that embodied the particular American conviction that justice should look like a Greek temple. Breyer arrived carrying Lenora Wren in a cloth sling against her chest. The baby was 6 weeks old, her eyes now fully transitioned from newborn blue to a distinctive hazel with amber flecks that seemed to shift color with the light. She was alert and calm, watching the proceedings with an attention that the court reporter later described as unsettling in an infant. Sterling occupied the plaintiff's table with Cordelia and their legal team, 4 attorneys in expensive suits who radiated the particular confidence of professionals who bill $400 per hour and have never lost a case they cared about. Behind them sat a representative from North Lake Development and 2 members of the county commission present as observers, but communicating through their presence exactly where the political winds were blowing. Breyer's table held Judge Caldwell, Dr. Ashcroft, and a stack of documents that represented months of preparation. The hearing proceeded through its procedural phases with the grinding efficiency of legal machinery. Sterling's attorneys presented their case with polished competence. Their lead counsel, a silver-haired partner from a Richmond firm whose billable rate exceeded the annual income of most Marshall County residents, stood before the bench with the relaxed authority of a man who had argued before appellate courts and found preliminary hearings to be a mild inconvenience. The North Lake Development Project would bring 300 jobs to the county. It would generate $12 million in annual tax revenue. It would transform a depressed rural economy into a thriving resort destination. The attorney displayed architectural renderings of the proposed resort, glossy images showing luxury cabins nestled among trees that would need to be removed to build them, a championship golf course that would require more daily water than the town of Marshall used in a week, and a spa complex whose central feature, ironically, was a mineral spring pool sourced from the very aquifer Breyer was fighting to protect. The only obstacle was a single property owner who refused to participate in progress. The word progress was used 11 times in the opening statement. Breyer counted. The attorney then shifted to the personal narrative Sterling and Cordelia had crafted. Breyer Holloway, he argued, was a woman of limited means and questionable judgment who had given birth unattended in a cabin without modern amenities. He carefully avoided mentioning Nell Harlan. He described the grimoire as a book of folk remedies and superstitions, suggesting that the Holloway women had a multi-generational history of eccentric behavior that culminated in Lenora's decision to leave her most valuable property to the one family member least equipped to manage it. Breyer watched Caldwell's jaw tighten as the attorney spoke. Ashcroft remained perfectly still, her pen moving across her notepad in the small, precise handwriting of someone cataloging ammunition rather than taking notes. When it was her turn, Breyer stood. Caldwell had prepared a statement for her. Ashcroft had coached her on delivery, on posture, on the particular art of speaking to a judge, as if speaking to a reasonable human being rather than a legal institution. Breyer set aside the prepared statement. Caldwell's hand moved as if to stop her, then settled back. He had spent 50 years watching Holloway women make decisions that terrified him and prove him wrong. He sat back and let this one proceed. She spoke instead from the place where fear and truth intersect, the place she had discovered during labor, the same threshold where every Holloway woman had stood and found that the only way through was forward. Your Honor, I am not a lawyer. I am not a politician. I am a 32-year-old mother who 6 months ago was sleeping in her car because she could not afford rent. The courtroom shifted. Sterling's lead attorney paused mid-note. The court reporter's fingers slowed on her machine, then resumed at a more careful pace, the way someone transcribes when they realize the words are going to matter. I inherited a cabin in the woods from my grandmother, and the people in this courtroom want to take it from me. They want to take it because beneath it lies a water source that their resort cannot function without. They have framed this as economic development. I would like to show you what they are actually proposing to develop. She placed the geological survey on the evidence table, then the independent water quality analysis, then the hydrological study showing that the aquifer beneath her property supplied groundwater to 3 surrounding counties, feeding wells and streams that 12,000 people depended on for drinking water. If North Lake Development accesses this aquifer for resort irrigation and recreational use, the draw rate will exceed natural recharge within 7 years. She cited page numbers, data points, projections. The architecture of water beneath the surface of the earth, laid out with the same precision she had once applied to landscape designs. The wells in Marshall Crestview in Barton County will begin to fail within a decade. Not might fail, will fail. The data is unambiguous. She paused, letting the numbers settle into the courtroom's silence. The petitioners described my grandmother's conservation work as the eccentricity of an elderly woman. They described the grimoire, our family's record of 3 centuries of environmental observation, as a book of superstitions. Breyer's voice hardened, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that comes from having survived something that burned away everything except the essential. I would like the court to consider that a woman they call eccentric spent 30 years and considerable personal fortune building legal protections around a water source that 12,000 of their constituents drink from every day. I would like the court to consider who in this room is actually behaving irrationally. She placed the Conservation Trust documents on the table. The easements. The environmental protections Lenora had spent 30 years constructing. My grandmother understood this. She spent her life building legal barriers around this water, not to hoard it, but to protect it for everyone. The water beneath my property does not belong to me. It does not belong to North Lake Development. It belongs to the 12,000 people whose wells it feeds, and the forests it sustains, and the streams it keeps flowing during droughts that are becoming more frequent and more severe every year. She paused, looking directly at the 2 county commissioners sitting in the gallery. One of them, a heavy-set man in a polyester suit, who had been leaning back in his chair with the comfortable posture of someone watching a formality, straightened perceptibly. Eminent domain exists to serve the public good. I am asking this court to consider which outcome actually serves it. A golf course that drains the aquifer in 7 years, or a conservation trust that protects it for centuries. The courtroom was silent. Lenora Wren, as if understanding that silence was the appropriate response to her mother's words, remained perfectly still against Breyer's chest, her eyes wide and watchful. Then Dr. Ashcroft stood and entered into evidence the expert testimony she had prepared. A professor of ethnobotany from the State University, who had reviewed the grimoire and submitted a 20-page assessment describing it as one of the most comprehensive records of Appalachian plant knowledge in existence, scientifically significant, historically irreplaceable, and categorically not evidence of mental instability, the professor had noted, in language carefully calibrated for legal consumption, that the grimoire's herbal remedy sections contained dosage information consistent with modern pharmacological understanding, suggesting that the women who compiled it possessed empirical medical knowledge that their era simply lacked the vocabulary to formalize. A hydrogeologist who confirmed the aquifer data and testified that the proposed development would cause irreversible damage to the regional water table. Under cross-examination, Sterling's attorney attempted to challenge the hydrogeologist's methodology. The expert responded with the patient condescension of a scientist addressing a layperson, explaining groundwater dynamics in terms so clear that even the county commissioners in the gallery appeared to understand them. The golf course alone, he noted, would consume enough water annually to fill a lake the size of 3 football fields to a depth of 6 feet. And finally, 3 residents of Marshall County who testified that their wells had already shown declining water levels over the past decade, and that further extraction would constitute a genuine public health crisis. The last of these witnesses, a 71-year-old farmer named Dale Hutchins, whose family had worked the same land for 4 generations, described in simple terms what it meant to watch your well go dry, not as an abstraction, not as a data point, as a fact of daily life that determined whether your cattle drank, whether your children bathed, whether the farm your grandfather built would survive to see your grandchildren. Sterling's attorneys objected, redirected, and cross-examined with the mechanical persistence of professionals earning their fee. But the architecture of their case had been designed to support a narrative of economic progress, and Breyer had reframed the conversation around water survival and the 15-year timeline after which progress would look a great deal like catastrophe. The judge reserved his ruling. The hearing adjourned at 4:17 in the afternoon. As the courtroom emptied, Sterling approached Breyer in the hallway. His face carried the expression of a man who has discovered that the game he was playing had more pieces than he counted. "This is not over," he said quietly. "No," Breyer agreed. "It is not." But his voice lacked the confidence it had carried 6 weeks ago in her cabin, when he had surveyed her property with the predatory calculation of a man accustomed to acquiring whatever he wanted. Something in the hearing had shifted the ground beneath his assumptions, and he knew it, and Breyer knew he knew it, and neither of them needed to say what both could see. Cordelia, standing several paces behind him, said nothing at all. Which, from a woman who had built her career on the precise deployment of words, was perhaps the most telling response of all. The ruling came down 12 days later. 12 days during which Breyer maintained the cabin, fed her daughter, walked the forest paths, and waited, with the particular tension of someone whose entire future depends on a document being written by a person she has never met in a building she may never enter again. She did not pray because she had never been certain enough of theology to commit to it, but she spoke to the forest, to the springs, to the walls of the cabin. And whether that constituted prayer or conversation, or simply the behavior of a woman under extraordinary pressure, the forest and the springs and the walls absorbed her words without judgment. The eminent domain petition was denied. The judge's written opinion cited insufficient evidence of public benefit and substantial evidence of potential public harm. He noted that the petitioners had failed to demonstrate that the proposed development would serve the community's interests more effectively than the existing conservation arrangements. He further noted that the aquifer data presented by the defense raised serious concerns about the long-term sustainability of any large-scale water extraction in the region. The custody petition was withdrawn by Cordelia's attorneys the same week following Dr. Ashcroft's filing of a comprehensive counter-motion. The motion included Nell Harlan's medical credentials and sworn testimony about the birth documentation of the newly installed solar power and water filtration systems, a certified home safety inspection conducted by the county health department at Breyer's invitation, and a pointed legal memorandum noting that the custody petition appeared to have been filed in coordination with the eminent domain action, suggesting its purpose was coercive rather than protective. The family court judge reviewing the counter-motion invited Cordelia's attorneys to withdraw voluntarily before he considered sanctions. They withdrew. Judge Caldwell called Breyer on the satellite phone to deliver the news. His voice, usually measured to the syllable, carried something she had never heard in it before: emotion uncontrolled by judicial temperament. "It is done," he said. "Both actions dismissed. The property is yours. Lenora Wren is yours. The Conservation Trust stands." Breyer sat on the cabin porch with her daughter in her arms and cried. Not the desperate tears of the past months, but the particular weeping that accompanies the release of a fear so large and like a physical weight being lifted from the body. Judge Caldwell arrived the following week for what he described as a final administrative visit. Breyer suspected it was something else entirely. He sat on the porch in the rocking chair. Lenora Wren balanced on his knee with the careful awkwardness of a man who had spent his life handling documents and now found himself holding something infinitely more valuable and considerably more fragile. The baby regarded him with her shifting hazel eyes, one hand grasping his index finger with a strength that seemed disproportionate to her size. Caldwell looked down at her, and his face underwent a transformation that Breyer watched with quiet reverence. The judicial mask dissolved. The carefully maintained composure of 50 years in law fell away like a garment he no longer needed. What remained was the face of a 78-year-old man holding a child who represented the continuation of everything he had spent his life protecting. His eyes were wet. He did not attempt to hide it. "Lenora told me you would change everything," he said, his voice stripped of its usual precision. "She said you would do what she could not. Open the doors, break the patterns." He looked up at Breyer, and in his gaze she saw not the judge, not the legal counsel, not the institutional guardian of her family's interests, but the young man who had stumbled into these woods 50 years ago, drowning in alcohol and self-destruction, and been saved by a woman who handed him spring water and silence, and the simple instruction to stop running. "She was right about you," he said. "She was right about everything except herself. She thought she was not brave enough. She was the bravest person I have ever known. She simply could not see it." Breyer placed her hand over his, the old man's weathered skin. Beneath hers, her daughter's tiny fingers still wrapped around his. "Will you be her godfather?" she asked. Caldwell did not answer immediately. He looked at the baby, then at the forest, then at the cabin that had stood for nearly 3 centuries, sheltering women who arrived alone and left stronger. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a verdict delivered after long and careful deliberation. "It would be the honor of my life." Everett walked through the jail's release door on a cold November morning, wearing the same clothes he had been arrested in, now wrinkled and carrying the institutional smell of confinement. His eye had healed, but retained a yellowish shadow beneath the brow. The arm was out of the sling, though he held it slightly guarded against his body. He squinted in the sunlight with the disorientation of someone who had spent months in fluorescent light and forgotten that the sun existed. Breyer waited beside her car with Lenora Wren in the sling. "You look terrible," she said. "You look like you have been fighting a war," he replied. "I have. We won." She handed him a folder as they drove west toward Hollow Creek. Inside were incorporation documents for the Holloway Conservation Partnership, a new entity designed to manage the property's sustainable forestry operations, the spring water company, and the educational programs Breyer was planning to establish. The partnership structure included positions for family members regardless of gender or branch, with governance shared between the keeper and a board of advisors. "I am changing the rules," Breyer said, her eyes on the winding road. "The keeper tradition stays. Lenora Wren will inherit the cabin and the primary stewardship when her time comes. But the work of protecting this place should not fall on one woman's shoulders. It never should have." Everett read through the documents in silence. When he reached the page listing him as Director of Forestry Operations, his hands stilled on the paper. "You are giving me a place," he said. "Not a question, a recognition. I am giving you the place that should have been yours all along, and your grandfather's, and every Holloway who was told that their blood was the wrong kind." They drove the rest of the way in silence, the kind that exists between people who have inflicted damage on each other and chosen repair over retribution. The forest thickened around them as the road narrowed, and when they turned at the lightning-struck oak, Everett drew a sharp breath. "I have never been to the cabin," he said. "My grandfather described it 1,000 times, but I was never invited." "You are invited now." Briar parked in the clearing and watched as Everett stepped from the car and stood very still, taking in the cabin. The porch, the chimney, the herb gardens now dormant with the onset of winter, the bronze bell hanging in its place. His face held the expression of a man seeing a photograph he had studied for decades suddenly spring into 3 dimensions. The November air was sharp, carrying the first honest cold of the season. Leaves had fallen in earnest since the storm, and the clearing was carpeted in bronze and gold, the trees around it standing in their bare architecture like cathedrals stripped to their structural truth. The cabin looked different in this season, more exposed, its silver-gray timber stark against the darker forest behind it. But the chimney trailed a thin line of smoke, and the windows glowed with firelight. And the clearing still held the quality of welcome that Briar had felt on her first evening here a lifetime ago. I walked to the porch steps and placed his hand against the railing, running his fingers along the wood as if reading Braille. He touched the carved stone in the doorframe, tracing the Latin inscription with his index finger, his lips moving silently around the words he had known since childhood. He examined the tree emblem, roots and branches in equal measure, the same symbol that appeared on the pendant Briar wore on the grimoire's cover. On the boundary stones his grandfather had maintained for 40 years. He had known about all of it. He had spent his life knowing. But knowing and standing here were different countries separated by an ocean of years and injustice. "My grandfather wept the only time he described this place to me," Everett said quietly. "I was 12. We were sitting on the porch of his house in town, the little clapboard place that always smelled of wood shavings and pipe tobacco, and he told me about the cabin and the springs and the women who kept them. He described this door frame, this stone, these exact words, verum in tenebris lucet. And then he wept. I didn't understand why. I thought he was sad because he couldn't come here. Now I think he was sad because he loved it so much, and love without belonging is the cruelest form of devotion." Briar opened the door and stepped aside. "Come home, Everett." He crossed the threshold slowly, each step carrying the weight of a journey that had begun long before he was born. Inside, the fire burned low in the hearth. The cabin smelled of cedar and herbs and the particular warmth that Briar now recognized as welcome. Everett stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly, his eyes cataloging details his grandfather had described and his imagination had furnished for 40 years. The rocking chair, the bookshelves with their leather-bound volumes, the window positioned to frame the western tree line, the dining table where generations of women had sat and made decisions that shaped the future of this land. When his gaze found the tree emblem carved into the mantel, identical to the one on the doorframe, identical to the pendant, Briar wore something in him collapsed, not dramatically, not with tears or noise, just a quiet folding in. The way a person folds when attention they have carried so long, it became invisible, is suddenly mercifully released. Briar did not speak. She placed Lenora Wren in his arms instead. Everett held the baby with the same careful uncertainty that Caldwell had shown the reverence of someone who understands that what they are holding is more important than anything they have ever held before. The infant looked up at him with her shifting hazel eyes and did not cry. She studied his face with the particular intensity she had shown from birth, as if cataloging every new person for a record she was already beginning to keep. "Welcome to your inheritance, little keeper," Everett whispered. "All of it, even the parts they tried to keep from people like me." Later that afternoon, Briar walked Everett to the North Spring. The path was easier in November, the fallen leaves compacting into a carpet that revealed the trail more clearly than the living undergrowth had concealed it in October. They walked slowly, Briar carrying Lenora Wren in the sling, Everett stopping frequently to examine trees and stones and subtle features of the landscape that he recognized from descriptions but had never seen. At the sentinel stone he knelt and placed both hands flat against the granite, the way someone places hands on the face of a person they have been separated from for too long. "My grandfather drew this for me," he said, his fingers tracing the carved topographical lines. On a napkin at the kitchen table from memory. He had every line memorized, every arrow, every contour. He could reproduce it perfectly because he had walked this land monthly for 40 years, and the map was not carved in this stone. It was carved in him. Briar watched him touch the stone and understood something that the grimoire's 3 centuries of women's knowledge had not quite articulated. The keeper tradition was a living thing, sustained not only by the women who bore the title, but by everyone who loved the land, whether or not they were acknowledged. Everett's grandfather had been a keeper in everything but name. He had given his devotion without recognition, his labor without compensation, his love without reciprocation. The tradition had not merely excluded the male line. It had consumed their service while denying their existence. "No more. I want you to write your grandfather's name in the grimoire," Briar said, "and your name. This record belongs to everyone who served this land, not only those who were permitted to call it theirs." Autumn was deepening toward its final act. When Briar sat down at the dining table for the last scene of a story she had not known she was living until she was already inside it. Lenora Wren slept in the cradle, her breathing synchronized with the cabin's deeper rhythms, the creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind against walls, the distant voice of the north spring flowing toward the aquifer that sustained everything above it. The blank journal that Judge Caldwell had delivered weeks ago lay open before her, its cream pages waiting, with the patience of objects that understand their purpose will arrive in time. Briar uncapped a pen. Not the fountain pen Lenora had used, or the steel nib Ada had preferred, but a simple ballpoint, the kind found in every kitchen drawer in America. She had considered something more ceremonial and rejected it. The tradition was changing, the tools could change with it. She wrote slowly, each word placed with the deliberate care of a woman who understood that what she put on this page would be read by her daughter, and her daughter's daughter, and women she would never meet whose lives would be shaped by the choices she was making now. "I am Briar Holloway, 13th keeper of the Hollow Creek legacy. I write this in autumn with my daughter sleeping beside me, and the forest settling into its winter rest. I will not hide what my grandmother hid. The aquifer data, the conservation research, the financial structures that protect this land, all of it will be made available to the county, to the universities, to anyone whose work serves the water and the forest and the people who depend on them. I will not choose alone what my grandmother chose alone. The Holloway legacy now includes every branch of this family, and the advisory board will welcome voices that were silenced for too long by a tradition that confused exclusion with protection. I will not pretend to be stronger than I am. I arrived here broken and afraid and 8 months pregnant with nowhere else to go. The cabin did not fix me. My daughter did not fix me. I am still broken in places, still afraid of things I cannot name. But I have learned from the women who wrote in the grimoire before me, and from the man who sat on this porch and wept while holding my child, that strength is not the absence of damage. It is the decision to build something worth protecting and then protect it not because you are certain you can, but because you are certain you must. This land belongs to everyone it feeds. This water belongs to the future. This cabin belongs to whoever needs it most. This is our beginning, open, honest, and unafraid. She set down the pen and listened. The fire spoke its quiet language in the hearth. The wind carried the forests breathing through walls that had sheltered women for 13 generations and would shelter more. Outside in the clearing, where late afternoon light fell in long golden columns through the thinning canopy, a red fox sat at the edge of the tree line. It had appeared 3 times since Lenora Wren's birth, always at the same spot, always facing the cabin with the calm attention of a sentry who has been posted to a station so long that vigilance has become indistinguishable from rest. Briar watched it through the window. The fox watched back. Behind her, Lenora Wren stirred in the cradle. A small sound, not a cry, but an announcement of waking, the particular noise that infants make when they are transitioning from one state of consciousness to another and want the world to take note. Briar turned from the window and lifted her daughter. The baby's eyes opened, that deep, shifting hazel that changed with every light, and focused with startling precision, not on her mother's face, but on the window behind her, on the clearing, on the fox. The infant's gaze held steady, tracking the animal with an awareness that exceeded her weeks of life by what seemed like centuries. She did not cry, she did not flinch. She looked at the fox the way someone looks at a friend they have not seen in a very long time but have never forgotten. The fox dipped its head once, a motion that might have been a trick of the fading light, or might have been something older than light itself. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest, its red coat swallowed by the autumn colors until it was indistinguishable from the leaves, from the earth, from the living pulse of a land that had been waiting with